This video will help you sleep and relax. But before we begin, I would like to know which city you're from and what time you're watching this. Now, subscribe to the channel, relax, and let's begin. I've been debating whether to share this for almost 10 years now. Even typing this makes my hands shake, but I need to get it out. Maybe someone here has experienced something similar and can make sense of what happened to me. I still can't. When I was 12, my mom and I were living in this trailer in Santa Cruz, California. We didn't own the property. It belonged to my mom's friend from work, who was letting us stay there until we got back on our feet after the divorce. The property was pretty isolated, surrounded by woods on 3 sides with this tall chain-link fence around the immediate yard area. Inside the fence was our trailer, a small garden my mom tried to keep alive, and this separate little room that was basically a shed that had been converted with electricity and insulation. I spent a lot of time in that room because it gave me some privacy and I could have friends over without bothering my mom. Outside the fence was this German shepherd that belonged to the property owner. That dog hated kids because some neighborhood boys had tormented it before we moved in. If I was alone, it would run up to the fence, snarling and trying to bite through the links. I was terrified of it, but the owner insisted it was protective, not aggressive. Yeah, right. This happened in the summer when I was 12. My friend Jacob had come over to spend the night, and we were in the separate room playing video games. It was probably around 10 p.m., and my mom was already asleep in the trailer. We were playing Halo on this tiny TV I had, and everything was completely normal until we heard this weird sound coming from the woods. It was this low rumbling noise, almost like someone was rolling something heavy through the undergrowth. We paused the game and looked at each other. At first, we thought maybe it was the property owner coming home late. He sometimes checked on things, but his truck made a distinctive sound, and this wasn't it. We turned off the game and just listened. The sound stopped for a few minutes, then started again, closer this time. It sounded like something was being dragged or rolled around just beyond the tree line. We were freaked out but tried to convince each other it was probably just an animal or something. After a while, the sound stopped, and we went back to playing our game. Around 11:30, Jacob needed to use the bathroom, which was in the trailer. I didn't want to go outside because of the dog, even though it was inside the fenced area, so Jacob went alone. I told him to hurry back. I kept playing the game, but started getting nervous when he didn't return after about 10 minutes. I tried to focus on the game, but after another 5 minutes, I got worried enough to check on him. When I opened the door to the room, Jacob was standing right there, just staring at me silently. I jumped and said something like, "Dude, you scared the crap out of me." But he didn't respond. He was just standing there, perfectly still, staring. Something felt off. His face looked normal, but his expression was blank, and when I reached out to push his shoulder, his skin was ice cold. Not just cool, but actually cold, like he'd been in a freezer. I felt this immediate sense of wrongness, that deep gut feeling where your whole body just screams at you that something isn't right. I pushed past him, suddenly desperate to get to the trailer, and I could feel him turn to watch me as I hurried across the yard. I didn't look back, but I could hear footsteps following me. When I got to the trailer and scrambled up the steps, I tried the door and found it locked. I had my key but was fumbling with it because my hands were shaking so badly. The whole time I could feel Jacob standing right behind me, not saying anything, just there. When I finally got the door open, I rushed inside and slammed it shut before he could follow me in. I went straight to the bathroom to find Jacob, but the door was locked. I knocked and called his name, and I heard his voice from inside say, "Yeah, I'll be out in a minute." I froze. Jacob's voice was coming from behind the bathroom door, but I had just seen him outside. My brain couldn't process what was happening. I started screaming for my mom, pounding on her bedroom door until she woke up. I was crying and probably not making much sense, but she got the idea that something was wrong. As she was trying to calm me down, we heard a knock at the trailer door. My mom went to answer it, but I begged her not to. She looked through the peephole and said, "It's just Jacob. What's going on with you?" She opened the door, and there was Jacob, looking confused and asking what all the screaming was about. A moment later, the bathroom door opened, and the real Jacob walked out. Both my mom and Jacob looked at me like I was crazy as I tried to explain what had happened. The Jacob who had been outside insisted he'd been in the bathroom the whole time and never stood outside the room staring at me. My mom eventually chalked it up to my imagination and went back to bed, telling us to settle down and get some sleep. Jacob and I went back to the separate room, both of us freaked out but trying to act tough. We tried to play more games to distract ourselves, but around 1 a.m., we heard the dog start barking outside. Not its normal aggressive bark, but this frantic, terrified sound. The barking turned into whimpering, and then we heard it running away, its chain jingling as it retreated to the farthest corner of the property. Then came the scratching. It started as a light scraping sound on the outside wall of our room. Slow, deliberate scratches that seemed to be moving around the perimeter of the room. We both froze, staring at each other. The scratching continued, getting slightly louder as whatever it was moved around to the wall behind us. Jacob whispered, "I'm going to get your mom." And before I could stop him, he bolted out the door. I wanted to follow him but was too scared to move. I sat there, listening to the scratching sounds move around to the door. Then they stopped. Not even 2 minutes later, Jacob burst back in, slamming the door behind him. His face was completely drained of color. He was breathing hard and looked like he was about to throw up. When I asked what happened, he said he'd seen my mom standing outside the fence, just staring at the property with a blank expression. "But that's impossible," I told him. "My mom's asleep in the trailer." Jacob swore up and down that he'd seen her standing there, completely still, wearing her bathrobe. He said when she noticed him, her face changed into this weird, awkward smile that didn't look right. That's when he ran back. We barricaded the door with the small desk and the chair, pushing it right up against the door handle. The scratching started again, moving methodically around all 4 walls of the room. It would stop occasionally, then start up somewhere else. This went on for what felt like hours. Around 3 a.m., the worst part happened. I heard my mom's voice, clear as day, right outside the wall where my bed was pushed up against. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice sounding hollow and distant despite being only inches away through the wall. "Go to sleep," she said a moment later. I was frozen in terror because I knew my mom was in the trailer. Whatever was outside wasn't her. Jacob heard it too, and we both sat huddled in the middle of the room, as far from the walls as possible, until dawn started breaking. The property owner usually came by early to feed his animals, and we refused to leave that room until we heard his truck pull up around 6:30 a.m. When he came to check on us, my mom had asked him to bring us breakfast. He had to remove the door because we had barricaded it so thoroughly. My mom didn't believe our story. She insisted she'd been asleep all night and never left the trailer. The property owner checked around the room and found nothing. No footprints, no scratches on the walls, nothing. Everyone brushed it off as our overactive imaginations, but Jacob refused to ever come back to my house again. We moved out about a month later when my mom found us an apartment closer to town. I never experienced anything like that again, and to this day, I have no explanation for what happened. I've read about skinwalkers and doppelgangers since then, and sometimes I wonder if that's what we encountered. Whatever it was, knew how to mimic both Jacob and my mom perfectly, and it seemed determined to lure us outside that night. I'm 22 now, and I still refuse to go outside alone at night. I won't live anywhere near the woods, and I sleep with a light on when I'm by myself. I keep telling myself it was just some elaborate prank or a shared hallucination, but deep down, I know what I experienced was real. That night in Santa Cruz changed something in me permanently. I just wish I knew what exactly was out there, scratching at our walls and wearing familiar faces. I still can't believe what happened to me last month at Meadowbrook Dairy in rural Ohio. I took that night security job because the pay was decent for our small town, $17 an hour to basically walk around a farm, checking locks and making sure the equipment wasn't stolen. I figured watching cows sleep would be the most boring job in the world, but I needed the money for community college. My boss, Frank, was this weathered old farmer who'd inherited the place from his dad. When he hired me, he mentioned I was replacing a guy named Corey who had some problems. That was putting it lightly. I later found out from the other farmhands that Corey was a recovering meth addict who'd been clean for about 8 months but still acted paranoid as hell. They said he'd been fired after one of the dairy cows went missing, specifically cow Fekr 29, and Corey couldn't explain how an 100-pound Holstein disappeared from a locked stall overnight. Frank gave me a quick tour that first evening. The property wasn't huge, just the main barn with about 40 stalls for the milking cows, a storage barn for equipment, and the milking facility. The pasture stretched out behind, maybe 20 acres bordered by dense woods. Nothing special, just your typical Ohio dairy operation. My first week was uneventful. I'd clock in at 8 p.m., do my rounds every couple hours, help bring in any cows that were still out in the field, and make sure the barns were locked up. The only weird thing was stall 29 sitting empty. Frank was weirdly insistent that we keep that stall clean and ready, even though there was no cow to put in it. This past Tuesday started like any other shift. I arrived, chatted with the evening farmhand, Jake, who was finishing up before heading home. He mentioned the cows were acting skittish that evening but didn't think much of it, probably just a coyote in the area or something. I started my first round about 9 p.m., flashlight in hand, walking the perimeter of the property. Nothing unusual. I went into the main barn to check on the cows, and that's when I noticed something off about stall number 29. The gate was slightly ajar, not wide open, just unlatched. I figured Jake must have forgotten to secure it after cleaning. When I went to close it, I noticed something small and yellow in the corner of the empty stall. I picked it up and immediately felt my stomach drop. It was a yellow plastic ear tag with 29 printed on it in faded black numbers. The same kind of tag all the cows wore, just lying there in the straw. Next to it were some small bones, too small for a cow, that looked like they might belong to a bat. I don't know why, but finding those things together made my skin crawl. I pocketed the tag, thinking I'd show Frank in the morning, and continued my rounds. Around 10:30 p.m., I noticed 3 cows were still out in the field. It was odd, since the evening staff usually brings them all in, but I figured Jake must have missed them in the dark. I grabbed a lead rope and headed out to the pasture. 2 of the cows came easily enough, following me back to the barn with minimal effort. But the third one, This is where things started getting really wrong. This cow was standing about 100 yards away, facing the woods. Even from a distance, I could tell something wasn't right about the way it was standing. Its tail was completely rigid, sticking straight out behind it. Its legs were planted wide apart, and its head, its head was tilted at almost a perfect 90-degree angle, like it was trying to press its ear against its shoulder. I called out to it like I would any other cow, making those clicking sounds with my tongue. It didn't move, not even a twitch. I started walking toward it, and when I was about 20 feet away, I heard this sound, a sort of dry, chittering noise, like fingernails tapping rapidly on wood. The sound stopped abruptly when I whistled at the cow. My instinct was telling me to go back to the barn, call Frank, and let him deal with whatever was wrong with this animal in the morning. But I was already out there, and I didn't want to seem incompetent my second week on the job. I approached slowly, talking softly like you're supposed to do with livestock. When I got close enough to touch it, I noticed its breathing was weird, not the steady in and out you'd expect, but shallow and rapid, almost vibrating. I reached out and touched its flank. The hide felt wrong, like clay with a loose sheet of cowhide draped over it. It was cold and had almost no give when I pressed on it. The cow didn't react to my touch at all, didn't shift weight, didn't flick its tail, nothing. It just kept staring sideways with its head at that impossible angle. That's when I noticed its eyes. They were peeled open way too wide, the whites showing all around, and the eyeballs were darting around rapidly, independently of each other, like they were searching for something. But the cow's head stayed completely still. I tried to get the lead rope around its neck, but it wouldn't budge when I pulled. It was like it was rooted to the ground. I pushed against its side, trying to get it to shift its weight, but it was like pushing against a concrete wall. The whole time, those eyes kept darting around, occasionally fixing right on me before flitting away. I decided this cow needed a vet, not a security guard. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on it, and reached for my phone to call Frank. As I was scrolling through my contacts, I heard movement behind me. I turned around, expecting to see one of the other cows I'd brought in earlier, but there was nothing there. When I turned back, the cow with the tilted head was gone. My heart started pounding. There's no way a cow could move that quickly without making noise, especially not one that had been frozen in place seconds before. I swept my flashlight across the field and finally caught a glimpse of it about 50 yards away, walking slowly toward the barn. Its head was still at that same twisted angle, but now it was moving with a jerky, unnatural gait, like it was being pulled forward by strings. I followed at a distance, watching as it entered the barn. By the time I got there, it had disappeared inside. The barn was dimly lit by a few security lights, casting long shadows between the stalls. I moved cautiously down the center aisle, checking each stall. Most held sleeping cows, but I couldn't find the one I'd been following. That's when I remembered stall 29. Something about finding that ear tag earlier pulled me toward that empty stall at the end of the barn. As I approached, I heard that chittering sound again coming from inside. I stopped, suddenly terrified of what I might find. I forced myself to move forward, one step at a time, until I was standing in front of stall 29. The gate was closed now and locked from the outside, which made no sense because I hadn't done that. I stood there frozen, listening to that dry tapping sound getting faster and more frantic. I don't know what possessed me to do it, but I reached for the latch to open the gate. As soon as my fingers touched the metal, the chittering stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was even worse. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears as I slowly slid the bolt back and began to pull the gate open. Before I could fully open it, I heard a shuffling sound behind me. I turned, and there it was. The cow was standing at the other end of the aisle, about 30 feet away, except it wasn't on all fours anymore. It was standing upright on its hind legs, its front legs hanging at its sides like arms. It must have been 8 feet tall like that, its head still cocked at that horrible angle, nearly touching its shoulder. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The thing's chest was expanding and contracting rapidly, that vibrating breath now audible across the distance between us. Its ears, normally floppy on a Holstein, were flapping independently of each other, like they were trying to catch sounds from different directions. Its eyes locked onto mine, and I watched in horror as one pupil grew to fill almost the entire eye, while the other shrank to a pinpoint. They pulsed like that, growing and shrinking alternately as it stared at me. Then it took a step forward. Its hoof made a wet, squelching sound on the concrete floor, like someone pushing their finger through mud. It opened its mouth, and that's when I lost it. The inside wasn't pink like a normal cow's mouth. It was black, pitch black, with what looked like too many teeth arranged in concentric circles. From that impossible mouth came a sound that wasn't a moo. It was like several voices layered on top of each other, some high and keening, others deep and gurgling, all saying something that almost made sense, but didn't quite form words. I bolted. I ran past the empty stalls on the other side of the barn, putting as much distance between me and that thing as possible. I heard it moving behind me, those hooves making wet slapping sounds on the concrete as it gave chase. I didn't look back. I couldn't bear to see if it was still on 2 legs, or if it had dropped to all 4s to pursue me. I burst out the side door of the barn and slammed it shut behind me, fumbling with the heavy wooden beam that served as a lock. I had just dropped it into place when something hit the door from the other side with incredible force. The wood creaked and bent inward, but the beam held. Another impact made the hinges groan. I backed away as the pounding continued, each hit making the wooden frame bend in ways it shouldn't. I ran to my car, hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. As I peeled out of the gravel driveway, I looked in my rearview mirror and saw the barn door finally give way. Something large moved in the shadows of the doorway, but I was already too far away to make out details. I'm grateful for that. I drove straight home, locked every door and window, and sat in my bathroom with the lights on until morning. I didn't sleep, couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that thing standing on 2 legs, its head twisted, its pupils pulsing as it stared at me. Frank called me the next morning, pissed that I'd abandoned my shift. I didn't pick up. He called 6 more times over the next 2 days, leaving increasingly angry voicemails about responsibility and letting the team down. I couldn't bring myself to tell him what I'd seen. Who would believe me? After 2 weeks of avoiding his calls, I finally worked up the courage to go back to the farm to collect my final paycheck. I figured I'd go during daylight, when there would be plenty of people around. I timed it for the middle of the afternoon when I knew Frank would be meeting with milk distributors in town. The farm looked normal in the daylight, peaceful even. A couple of farm hands were working in the milking facility, and I nodded to them as I walked toward the office where Frank had told me my check would be waiting. As I passed the main barn, I couldn't help but glance inside. Everything looked ordinary. Cows in their stalls, eating or resting. Even stall number 29 had a cow in it now, a new one, presumably bought to replace the missing number 29. I was almost beginning to think I'd had some kind of breakdown that night, that maybe the stories about Corey's paranoia had gotten into my head. That's when I noticed a young farmhand I didn't recognize standing by the back wall of the barn. He was staring intently at something on the ground, what looked like a small pile of bones, similar to the bat bones I'd found in stall number 29 that night. As I watched, he slowly tilted his head sideways until his ear nearly touched his shoulder, exactly like cow number 29 had done. He must have sensed me watching because he suddenly straightened up and turned toward me. For just a second, so quick I almost missed it, I saw his pupils pulse, one dilating while the other contracted. I didn't stay for my paycheck. I got in my car and drove, and I haven't been back since. I've been staying with my cousin 2 counties over, and I'm looking for jobs as far away from Meadowbrook Dairy as I can get. I don't know what was happening at that farm. I don't know what happened to the original cow nut 29 or to Corey or what that thing I saw was. But sometimes when it's quiet at night, I swear I can hear that chittering sound, like dry fingernails tapping against my window. And in my dreams, I see that farm hand, his head tilted at that impossible angle, his pupils pulsing as he watches me from the shadows. About 2 years ago, I moved into this small house on the edge of town. It wasn't anything special, just a single-story place with a decent backyard that backed up to some woods. The rent was cheap, and I was trying to save money after a messy breakup. About 3 weeks after moving in, I noticed this black cat hanging around my back porch. Not just any black cat. This thing was skinny as hell, like it hadn't eaten in weeks. Its ribs were showing through its matted fur, and it would just sit there at the edge of my yard watching my house. What really freaked me out, though, were its eyes. They were this weird pitch-black color like tar or oil. They didn't reflect light at all, not even when my porch light would hit them directly at night. Most cat eyes glow or at least reflect something, right? These were just empty, like looking at 2 black holes. I felt bad for it, despite how unsettling it looked. I'm not even really a cat person, but I couldn't just let it starve. So I started putting out some leftover chicken from my dinner one night. I set the plate down and went back inside, watching through the window as it crept forward. It didn't eat like a normal cat either. It kind of tore at the meat aggressively, making these weird guttural noises. But whatever, I figured it was just really hungry. The next morning when I went to get the plate, I found a dead bird next to it. Just a small sparrow, completely intact, but definitely dead. I thought it was weird, but assumed the cat had caught it and left it there. I'd heard cats sometimes bring gifts to people who feed them. Gross, but somewhat normal, right? I tossed it into the woods behind my yard and didn't think much more about it. That evening, I put out more food. The next morning, 2 dead mice, lined up perfectly side by side. The day after that, a dead chipmunk. This went on for about 2 weeks, and the gifts kept getting bigger. Rats, a squirrel, even a rabbit once. I never saw the cat actually bring these things. They would just appear overnight like some twisted calling card. I considered stopping feeding it, but by this point, I was honestly a little afraid of what might happen if I did. The cat was looking healthier now, less skeletal, but those eyes remained just as disturbing. It started getting bolder too, sometimes sitting right at my back door instead of at the edge of the yard. It would stare at me through the glass for hours, completely motionless. I started keeping the blinds closed. Then came that foggy morning about a month into this weird relationship. I woke up early, around 5:30 a.m., because the fog was so thick it was reflecting the streetlights and making my bedroom brighter than usual. I got up to use the bathroom and glanced out my back window out of habit. I literally staggered backward and fell against the wall, My entire backyard, I mean the entire yard, was covered with dead animals, birds, squirrels, mice, rats, possums, even a couple of raccoons. Some were intact, others were not. There must have been 30 or 40 carcasses arranged in some kind of circular pattern across my lawn. And right in the center sat that damn black cat, staring directly at my window as if it knew I'd be looking. I immediately closed the blinds and called animal control in a panic. By the time they arrived 2 hours later, there was nothing there, not a single dead animal. The yard was completely clean, except for the cat, which was sitting in its usual spot by the porch. The animal control officer clearly thought I was nuts or on drugs. She offered to take the cat, but when we went outside, it was gone. That night, I locked every door and window in my house and tried to convince myself I had hallucinated the whole thing. Maybe I was working too much. Maybe I needed therapy. Maybe the stress from my breakup was catching up to me. I took a sleeping pill and passed out around 10 p.m. I woke up at exactly 3:17 a.m. I know because I checked my phone immediately, trying to figure out what had woken me. There was no sound, but I had this overwhelming sense that something was watching me. You know that feeling when you're being stared at? It was like that, but 100 times more intense. My bedroom faces the backyard, and even though the blinds were closed, I could see that it was unusually bright outside, like the full moon was directly overhead. Against my better judgment, I got out of bed and peeked through the blinds. Standing in the middle of my yard was, I don't even know how to describe it. It looked vaguely human-shaped, but all wrong. It was tall, maybe 6'5" or 7 feet, but unnaturally thin, with arms that hung down almost to its ankles. Its skin was this sickly grayish-white color, like a corpse that's been in water too long. Parts of its body had patches of black fur, the same color as the cat's, growing in random spots across its chest, shoulders, and face. But its face, Jesus, its face is what still keeps me up at night. It had sunken, hollow eye sockets with the same tar-black eyes as the cat, but larger. Its nose was just 2 dark slits, and its mouth was way too wide for its face, stretching almost ear to ear. Its spine protruded so sharply through its back that it looked like a row of knives trying to cut through its skin. I stood there frozen, unable to move or breathe or even think. The thing tilted its head at an impossible angle, like its neck had an extra joint, and then it smiled. I don't mean it grinned or smirked. Its mouth literally stretched open to reveal rows of jagged, needle-like teeth. Somehow I managed to drop the blinds and stumble backward onto my bed. I was hyperventilating, convinced I was about to die. I grabbed my phone to call 911, but couldn't even unlock it because my hands were shaking so badly. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, I gathered enough courage to look again. The yard was empty. No creature, no cat, nothing. Just the moonlight on the grass. I spent the rest of the night huddled in my bed with all the lights on. When morning finally came, I almost convinced myself it had been a nightmare until I opened my back door. Spread across my porch and yard were more mutilated animals than ever before, but this time they were arranged in a very specific pattern that looked almost like a giant paw print. And right in the center of this macabre display sat the black cat, grooming itself as casually as if it were someone's house pet. It looked up at me and made direct eye contact, and I swear to God it smiled, not like a normal cat, but with an actual human-like smile that revealed rows of teeth that were far too numerous and sharp for any normal feline. I slammed the door shut, ran to my bedroom, and started throwing clothes into a duffel bag. I needed to get out of there. My sister lives about 30 miles away in the next town over, and I knew she'd let me crash at her place. As I was loading my car, I noticed the cat sitting on my front lawn, watching me. I tried to ignore it as I got in my car and sped away, but in my rearview mirror, I could see it sitting motionless, those black eyes following me until I turned the corner. I arrived at my sister's place and broke down as soon as she opened the door. I told her everything about the cat, the dead animals, and the creature I'd seen. She didn't believe me, of course. She thought I was having some kind of breakdown and suggested I see someone, but she let me stay. For 3 days, I didn't leave her house. I called in sick to work and spent most of my time looking out her windows, half expecting to see that cat or the creature lurking somewhere nearby. My sister was starting to get worried about me, saying I was becoming paranoid. Maybe she was right. On the 4th day, I finally started to feel a little better. Maybe it had all been in my head. Maybe there was a normal explanation for everything that had happened. My sister had to work late that night, so I was alone in her house for the first time since arriving. Around 8 p.m., the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, and a wave of dread washed over me. I tried to tell myself I was being ridiculous. It was probably just a neighbor or a delivery person. I approached the front door slowly and looked through the peephole. There was no one there, just her empty front porch under the porch light. See? I was being paranoid. I opened the door anyway, just to be sure, and looked down. Lying on the welcome mat was the body of the black cat, except it wasn't really a cat anymore. Half of its body was decomposed, with bones showing through rotting flesh. The other half was changing. The fur was patchy, with that same pale grayish skin showing through. One of its front legs was elongated, almost like a human arm, with claw-like fingers forming at the end. But the worst part was its face. Its mouth had split open, stretching too wide across what was once a cat's head, filled with those same needle-like teeth I'd seen on the creature. And its eyes, those oil-black eyes, were open and staring right at me, even though the thing was clearly dead. I slammed the door and locked it, then ran through the house, locking every window and door I could find. I called my sister in a panic, but she didn't answer. I left her a voicemail to stay away from the house, that something dangerous was outside. When I finally worked up the courage to look out the front window again, the cat's body was gone, but scratched into the wooden boards of my sister's front porch was a crude symbol, the same paw print pattern that the dead animals had formed in my yard. That was 2 days ago. I'm currently writing this from a motel room about 100 miles away. I didn't even tell my sister where I was going. I just left her a note saying I needed to get away for a while and took off. I don't know what that thing is. I don't know if it was once the cat or if the cat was always just a part of it. I don't know why it chose me or what it wants, but I know it's following me. Last night I heard scratching at my motel room door. When I looked through the peephole, there was nothing there, but when I woke up this morning, there was a dead bird on the walkway right outside my door. I'm leaving as soon as I finish writing this. I don't know where I'm going next. I just know I can't stay in one place for too long. Sometimes when I close my eyes, I can still see those tar-black eyes staring at me through my bedroom window, and that impossibly wide smile filled with teeth. If you ever see a skinny black cat with eyes that don't reflect light, don't feed it. Don't acknowledge it. Just leave. Because I'm starting to think it's not the cat that's following me. It's what the cat brought with it. I've been sitting here for an hour trying to figure out how to write this. My hands are shaking even now. I've never told anyone outside my family about what happened, but after last night I need to get this out there. Maybe someone else has experienced something similar. This happened when I was 11, back when we used to visit my grandmother every summer on the reservation. She lived in this small wooden house, miles from anything you could call a town. No running water, just a well out back. She cooked everything on a wood stove, which meant someone always had to keep the wood pile stocked. That summer day started like any other. The sky was cloudless, perfect blue stretching for miles. Uncle Jaden came by around noon and asked if I wanted to help gather firewood for Grandma. I jumped at the chance. I always loved riding in his old Ford pickup, this rusted blue thing that rattled like it might fall apart any second. Plus, Uncle Jaden always let me sit in the front seat, which made me feel grown up. We drove about 20 minutes into the forest on this dirt road that was barely more than 2 tire tracks cutting through the pines. Uncle's truck bounced over every root and rock, and I remember laughing each time my butt left the seat. It was fun then. We spent maybe 2 hours gathering wood, Uncle chopping while I stacked the smaller pieces in the truck bed. It was hot work, but satisfying. I remember the smell of fresh-cut pine and sweat, the sound of birds overhead. Normal stuff, safe stuff. The sun was starting to sink by the time we finished. Not sunset yet, but maybe 5 or 6 in the afternoon. Uncle said we should head back before dark. I didn't argue. Even then, I hated being in the woods after the sun went down. We got in the truck and started back down that same dirt road. That's when it started. We were maybe 5 minutes into the drive when this weird feeling crept over me. At first I thought it was just getting cold, you know, like when the sun starts to go down and the temperature drops quick. But it wasn't that. It was this feeling like someone was staring at me. Not just looking, staring, like when you can feel eyes burning into the back of your head. I tried to ignore it, but it kept getting stronger until my skin was literally crawling with goosebumps. I remember turning my head toward my window, thinking maybe I'd see a deer or something watching us from the trees. That's when Uncle Jaden shouted, "Don't!" His voice was so sharp, so urgent that I froze halfway through the motion. "What?" I asked, my heart suddenly pounding. "Look at me," he said, his voice quieter but still tight. "Just look at me, buddy. Look right here." I did what he said, focusing on his profile. His jaw was clenched so tight I could see the muscle bulging. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel. That's when I heard it. This soft, deliberate tapping on my window. Tap, 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 like fingernails on glass. My breath caught in my throat. Every part of me wanted to turn and look, but Uncle's eyes flicked to mine, and he gave this tiny shake of his head. "Don't look," he whispered. Then he pressed the gas pedal to the floor. The truck lurched forward, engine whining as we picked up speed on that rough road. Uncle started praying in our native language, something I'd only heard the elders do during ceremonies. His voice was shaking. "Uncle, what is it?" I whispered. "Listen to me," he said, his voice steady despite the fear I could see in his eyes. "Look at me and don't turn away. Whatever happens, whatever you hear, don't look out the windows. You understand?" I nodded, terrified. The tapping followed us, keeping pace with the truck even as we sped up. How was that possible? We had to be going at least 40 mph down a bumpy dirt road. Nothing should have been able to keep up with us, let alone stay steady enough to tap on the glass. Suddenly, the truck dipped hard to one side, like something heavy had jumped into the bed. The suspension groaned. The whole truck shifted under the weight. I heard the firewood sliding around in the back. Uncle cursed under his breath, but kept driving, kept praying. I was shaking so bad my teeth were chattering. The tapping stopped for a moment, and in that brief silence my fear somehow doubled. Then it started again. this time from behind us, on the rear window of the cab. Tap, tap, tap. Whatever had been outside my window was now inside the truck bed with all our firewood. I started crying. I couldn't help it. Uncle reached over with one hand and gripped my shoulder. "It's okay," he said, though we both knew it wasn't. "Just a little longer. We're going to be okay." I don't know how long we drove like that, probably only a minute or two, but it felt like hours. The tapping never stopped, never slowed. Sometimes it would move, tapping a pattern across the glass from one side to the other, like it was trying to find a way in, or like it was playing with us. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the truck dipped again, the same sensation of weight being lifted off the back. Uncle's eyes darted to the rearview mirror, and he let out a long, shaky breath. He kept driving fast for another 5 minutes, both of us silent except for his quiet prayers. Finally, he slowed the truck and pulled over onto the shoulder. He turned the engine off and just sat there for a moment, breathing hard. When he looked at me, his face was pale, covered in sweat. "Are you okay?" he asked. I nodded, though I wasn't. Not at all. He looked around outside, scanning the trees on both sides of the road. Then he turned back to me. "We need to get home," he said. "I'll ask your father to do a prayer in the morning, a cleansing, so that evil will forget our faces." I didn't understand what he meant then, but I nodded anyway. He started the truck again, and we drove the rest of the way to Grandma's. Uncle sang old prayers the whole time, his voice sometimes breaking. When we got to Grandma's, Uncle told me not to mention what happened. He said it would only frighten her. We unloaded the wood in silence, and when Dad asked why we looked so shaken, Uncle just said we'd seen a bear. Dad seemed suspicious but didn't push it. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that tapping. Tap, tap, tap. When I finally did fall asleep, I had nightmares about dark shapes running alongside the truck, keeping pace no matter how fast we drove. In the morning, Dad and Uncle performed a cleansing ceremony. They never explained exactly why, just that it was necessary. After that, we never spoke about what happened. Life went on, and eventually the memory faded. Not gone, but dulled by time. I'm 27 now. I haven't been back to the reservation in years. My grandmother passed away, and the family sold her property. Uncle Jaden still lives nearby, though. We talk on the phone every few months, catching up on family stuff. Normal conversations. We never mentioned that day, until 3 nights ago. I had this nightmare, the first one about that incident in years. In the dream, I was back in that truck, but I was my current age. Uncle was driving, just like before. I felt that same watching sensation, heard the tapping. But in the dream, I didn't listen to Uncle. I turned to look. I woke up screaming, my sheets soaked with sweat. Without thinking, I called Uncle Jaden. It was 3 a.m., but he answered on the second ring like he'd been waiting for my call. "You had the dream, didn't you?" he asked before I could even explain why I was calling. My blood went cold. "How did you know?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Because I've been having it too, for the past week." We sat in silence, just breathing into our phones. Finally, I asked the question I'd been too afraid to ask as a kid. "Uncle, what was out there that day? What was following us?" Another long pause. Then, "There are things in this world that don't have names in English," he said. "Things that have been here long before us, that will be here long after. Things that hunger." "But what did you see?" I pressed. "Eyes," he said simply, "like brake lights in the dark. watching us, waiting for one of us to look at it. A chill ran down my spine. Why didn't you want me to look? Because some things can't touch you unless you acknowledge them first, he said. Unless you invite them in, even if it's just with a glance. I tried to lighten the mood with a nervous laugh. So why didn't you step on the brakes when it was in the back of the truck? Could have thrown it off. His answer made my heart stop. Because it wasn't alone. After we hung up, I couldn't get back to sleep. I kept thinking about those eyes like brake lights, about whatever had been keeping pace with our truck on a rough dirt road, about what might have been waiting in the trees. Last night, I woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of tapping on my bedroom window. Tap, tap, tap. 3 soft, deliberate sounds. I live on the 5th floor of my apartment building. I froze in my bed, suddenly 11 years old again, feeling that same overwhelming sensation of being watched. The tapping came again. Tap, tap, tap. Every instinct screamed at me to look, to see what was there. Instead, I remembered Uncle's words and kept my eyes fixed on the ceiling. I started whispering the prayer I'd heard him say all those years ago. I don't speak our language fluently, but I remembered those words. They felt hot in my mouth, like they were burning my tongue. The tapping continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Then it stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse. I don't know if the cleansing ceremony my father performed all those years ago wore off, or if whatever was out there that day has been patient, waiting for the right moment. But I know it's found me now. I can feel it. I called Uncle Jaden this morning. No answer. I've tried 5 times. Nothing. It's getting dark now. I've closed all the blinds in my apartment, but it doesn't help. I can still feel eyes on me, watching from somewhere I can't see, waiting. The tapping just started again, this time at my front door. I don't know what to do. I don't know how long I can keep from looking. I still can't sleep through the night. It's been 3 weeks since it happened, and every time I close my eyes, I see her face. That's not even the right word for it. What was left of her face. I've been debating whether to share this at all, but I need to tell someone who might believe me. I grew up in Millbrook, one of those towns so small it barely shows up on maps, the kind where everyone knows your business before you do. I've been working at Hal's Gas and Go for almost 5 years now, the only gas station for about 30 miles in any direction. It's a decent enough job, boring most days, which used to be just fine by me. This all started 15 years ago when I was 12. My best friend Tommy Winters and I were inseparable that summer. Both of us were obsessed with finding treasure, real buried treasure like in the movies. We'd spend hours digging holes in his backyard until his mom made us fill them all back in. Then Tommy got this idea. "We should check out Blackbriar Farm," he said one day while we were riding bikes down Main Street. My dad says the Blackbriars disappeared with all their money. Bet it's still there somewhere. Everyone in Millbrook knew about the Blackbriars. The whole family vanished in 1978. Mom, Dad, and their 2 teenage kids. Just gone overnight. Left their clothes, their cars, everything. The case went cold decades ago. No one ever moved into the property, and the bank never sold it because of some legal complications. The weirdest part was that despite being abandoned, the cornfields kept growing year after year. People said it was because the soil was so rich there, but it gave the whole place an eerie feeling. I didn't want to go. Even at 12, something about that place felt wrong. But Tommy had a way of talking me into things. "Don't be such a baby," he said. We'll be back before dinner. It was October 27th. I remember the date because Halloween was coming up, and Tommy and I were arguing about our costumes. The sun was already getting low when we pedaled our bikes down the dirt road leading to Blackbriar. We hid them in the tall grass by the road. If our parents found out we'd gone there, we'd be grounded until college. The farmhouse itself was falling apart. Broken windows, peeling paint, porch caving in. But it was the cornfield that Tommy was interested in. If they hid something, it wouldn't be in the house where people might look, he reasoned. It'd be somewhere nobody would think to check. The cornfield stretched for acres, tall stalks swaying gently even though there wasn't much wind. As the sun started setting, long shadows stretched across the ground. I wanted to leave, but Tommy was already pushing his way between the rows of corn. "Come on," he called back. "Don't you want to be rich?" I followed him, trying to keep track of which way we'd come in. The corn was still growing, taller than it should have been that late in the season. Above us, the sky was turning that deep orange red that happens right before nightfall. We'd been walking for maybe 15 minutes when we first heard it, sobbing. Soft at first, like maybe it was just the wind, but then unmistakable. A woman crying. Tommy stopped. "You hear that?" I nodded, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. "Hello?" Tommy called out. "Is someone there?" The crying continued. We followed the sound, pushing through the cornstalks until we reached a small clearing in the middle of the field. And there she was, a woman in a white dress sitting on the ground with her back to us. Her hair was long and dark, hanging down her back in tangled strands. She was rocking slightly, her shoulders shaking as she cried. "Ma'am," Tommy said, taking a step forward. "Are you okay?" I grabbed his arm. "Don't," I whispered. Something was wrong. I couldn't explain it, but every instinct was screaming at me to run. The woman suddenly stopped crying. The silence was worse somehow, thick and heavy. "Ma'am?" Tommy tried again, shaking off my hand and moving closer. That's when she turned around. It wasn't fast like in movies. It was unnaturally quick, like someone had filmed her turning and cut out frames. 1 second she was facing away, the next she was looking right at us, but without the movement in between. Her face, God, her face. It wasn't a face anymore. The skin was gray and shriveled, clinging to her skull in patches. One cheek was completely gone, showing her jawbone and teeth. Her eyes were cloudy and lifeless, but somehow fixed directly on us. There were holes where her nose should have been. Tommy screamed. I couldn't make a sound. I was frozen. She moved toward Tommy in that same jerky, unnatural way. Before either of us could react, her hand shot out and grabbed his wrist. I heard the crunch of bones. Tommy's scream turned into something higher, something animal. Her jaw began to open. Not like a person's mouth opens, but wider. The skin at the corners of her mouth tearing as it stretched impossibly far, like a snake unhinging its jaw to swallow something whole. "Run!" Tommy screamed at me, his face contorted in pain as she pulled him closer. "Run!" I ran. God help me, I ran. Cornstalks whipped at my face as I crashed through the field, completely disoriented, just trying to get away. I could hear Tommy screaming behind me, and then nothing. The sudden silence was worse than the screaming. I found my way out of the cornfield somehow, and didn't stop running until I reached the sheriff's office in town. Sheriff Brandt found me hyperventilating, covered in scratches, unable to form complete sentences. When I finally calmed down enough to tell him what happened, he immediately organized a search party. Half the town went out to Blackbriar that night with flashlights and shotguns. They searched until morning. They never found Tommy, just one of his shoes, sitting in that small clearing in the cornfield. No blood, no signs of struggle, nothing else. It was like he'd vanished into thin air, just like the Blackbriar family. Everyone had theories. Some thought Tommy had run off in a different direction and gotten lost in the woods beyond the farm. Others suggested he'd fallen into an old well or mine shaft. A few people even accused me of making the whole thing up after accidentally hurting Tommy myself. The searches continued for weeks, then months. Tommy's parents put up missing posters all over the county. His mom would stand at the edge of the Blackbriar property, just calling his name for hours. Eventually, they moved away. I don't blame them. As for me, I had nightmares every night for years. I'd see that woman's face, her jaw unhinging, reaching for me. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, convinced she was in my room. My parents took me to therapists who said I was suffering from trauma and an overactive imagination. They put me on medications that made me feel foggy, but didn't stop the dreams. 15 years passed. I never went near Blackbriar again. I finished high school, tried community college for a semester, dropped out, and ended up working at the gas station. Not the life I'd planned, but at least it was predictable. Safe. I was planning to finally leave Millbrook at the end of this month. My cousin in Columbus said he could get me a job at the warehouse where he works. Better pay, a chance to start over somewhere people don't look at me like I'm crazy or damaged. 3 weeks ago, on October 27th, exactly 15 years after Tommy disappeared, I was closing up the gas station. It was around 10:30 p.m., and I was the only one there. Hal, the owner, had left hours earlier. It was a quiet night, hardly any customers after 9. I was counting the register when I heard it, sobbing, coming from across the road, where there's nothing but fields stretching back toward the old Blackbriar property, about 2 miles away. At first, I thought it was just the wind or my mind playing tricks. But it got louder, unmistakable. A woman crying. My hands started shaking so bad, I dropped the roll of quarters I was holding. They burst open, coins scattering across the floor. I didn't care. I moved to the front windows, peering out into the darkness. There was a streetlight at the edge of the parking lot, casting a small circle of yellowish light. At the very edge of that circle, I could see her, the woman in the white dress, standing perfectly still, facing the gas station, facing me. I stumbled back, knocking over a display of beef jerky. This couldn't be happening. It wasn't real. I'd been working too many late shifts, not sleeping enough. But when I forced myself to look again, she was closer, standing at the edge of the parking lot now. I couldn't see her face clearly from that distance, but I didn't need to. I knew what it looked like. I abandoned the register and ran to the back office, locking the door behind me. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped my phone twice before managing to call Sheriff Dorsey. Brant had retired years ago. "There's someone at the gas station," I told him, trying to keep my voice steady. "The woman from Blackbriar, the one who took Tommy." There was silence on the other end, then a sigh. "Listen, I know this time of year is hard for you, with the anniversary and all. I'm not making this up," I nearly shouted. "She's here." All right, he said. "I'll swing by. Just stay put." I hung up and immediately called Hal to tell him I was leaving, that there was an emergency. I couldn't stay there another minute. Through the small window in the office, I could see the main store area was empty. I unlocked the door and crept out, moving as quietly as possible. The sobbing had stopped, but that didn't mean she was gone. I grabbed my keys and made a run for the side door that led to the employee parking area. My old Honda was the only car there. As I fumbled with my keys, I made the mistake of glancing up. She was standing on the other side of my car, just watching me. In the dim light of the parking area, I could see her face clearly now. It was exactly as I remembered, the exposed bone, the gray skin, the empty eyes. If anything, she looked worse, more decayed. I don't remember getting in my car. I don't remember driving home. The next thing I knew, I was sitting in my driveway, engine still running, knuckles white from gripping the steering wheel. I ran into my apartment and double-locked the door behind me. Sheriff Dorsey called about 30 minutes later to say he'd checked the gas station and found nothing unusual, just the register left open and some change on the floor. He reminded me that I couldn't keep doing this and suggested I talk to someone professionally. I took every pill I had that might help me sleep and somehow managed to pass out on my couch with all the lights on. The sound of crying woke me up around 3 a.m. It was coming from outside my window. I've been staying at a motel off the highway for the past 3 weeks. I quit my job at the gas station. I'm leaving for Columbus tomorrow, tonight, if I can get my cousin to wire me enough money for the bus ticket. I don't know why she's back after all these years. I don't know what she did to Tommy or the Blackbriar family. I just know she's not done. 3 nights ago, the motel clerk said someone was asking for me, a woman in a white dress. He said he couldn't see her face because she was standing in the shadows, but she knew my name. I keep my door barricaded now. I don't sleep much. Sometimes in the quiet hours of the night, I think I hear Tommy's voice, just on the edge of my consciousness. He's still telling me to run. I've been putting off writing about this for 17 years now. Even typing this up is making my hands shake. But after seeing so many similar accounts from Pine Ridge, I think it's time I share what happened to me. Maybe somebody out there can make sense of it. Back in 2006, I was going through a rough patch with my then wife. We'd been having problems for months, and she finally moved back in with her mom, taking our kids with her. I was devastated, but still wanted to be near my family, so I arranged to stay at my mother-in-law's old mobile home on their family property. It sat empty most of the time since they'd moved to a newer place nearby. This was out near BIA 23, real rural area of the res. If you know Pine Ridge, you know how isolated some of these places can get. The property sat along a creek with thick vegetation all around. Plum bushes, chokecherry bushes, elm trees down low, and pine trees up on the hills. Beautiful during the day, but at night, man, different story entirely. When I arrived that evening, something felt off about the trailer. Can't explain it exactly, just a heaviness in the air. I'd been raised with all the old stories, all the warnings about sleeping outdoors after dark. But I figured being in a vehicle was different, you know. Plus, I wasn't keen on staying inside that empty trailer. It felt watched. So I decided to sleep in my Tahoe instead. I folded down the back seats, spread out some blankets, and set up my little portable DVD player to watch movies until I fell asleep. It was a clear night. Moon was out, but not full. Still bright enough to cast shadows across the yard. The trailer was about 30 feet from where I'd parked, facing it with the creek and trees behind. Around midnight, I was watching some comedy I'd seen 100 times, trying to keep my mind off the divorce and all that mess. That's when I noticed something move in my peripheral vision, just outside the window. I figured it was probably a deer or something. They come down to the creek all the time. But something made me pause the movie and turn it off. The sudden quiet hit me like a physical thing. No crickets, no nightbirds, nothing. Just dead silence. I remember thinking that was weird because summer nights out there are usually noisy with insects and stuff. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I noticed a dark shape at the back corner of the trailer. At first, I thought someone was trespassing. Maybe one of the local guys looking to steal stuff from the empty place. I was about to call out when I realized something wasn't right about the proportions. This figure was tall, really fucking tall. The trailer roof was probably 12 feet at its highest point, and this thing was a good 1.5 feet taller. I'm not exaggerating. It was hunched a bit, but its head was well above the roofline. I froze completely. Couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Just watched as this thing moved to the first window of the trailer. It had to bend down, putting its hands on the roof to stabilize itself as it peered inside. The way it moved was methodical, deliberate. It would look in each window, rock back and forth slightly, then move to the next one, like it was searching for something. I remember thinking, this isn't happening. I'm dreaming. This isn't real. But I wasn't dreaming. I was wide awake, paralyzed with fear. The thing finished checking one side of the trailer and rounded the corner to the next wall. Now it was directly facing my Tahoe, though it hadn't noticed me yet. In the moonlight, I could see it was dark, not just shadowed, but actually dark-skinned or covered in something dark. Not like a person, not like any animal I've ever seen. Its proportions were all wrong, arms too long, torso too narrow. I accidentally kicked my DVD player trying to shrink back from the window. The small noise seemed deafening in the silence, and the thing immediately stopped what it was doing and turned toward my vehicle. I dove under the blankets like a scared kid. I know, stupid reaction, but pure instinct took over. I was shaking so hard I thought the whole car might be vibrating. I stayed completely still under those blankets for what felt like hours, but was probably 10 minutes. The whole time I was thinking about those old stories my grandmother used to tell, about the dark man, about the spirits that own the night on the reservation, about why we don't sleep outside. Then I felt it. The whole Tahoe shifted slightly, like when someone leans against your car. That small rocking motion. I nearly pissed myself. There was silence for maybe 30 seconds, then another gentle rock of the vehicle. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to look. With every ounce of courage I had, I pulled the blanket down just enough to see out the window. It was right there, face pressed against the glass, hands cupped around its eyes to see inside better. It was... God, I don't even have words for what I saw. Just ugly doesn't cover it. Its features were almost human but distorted, like someone had stretched a face in all the wrong directions. The eyes were too wide apart, the mouth too large, and it was rocking, that same strange back-and-forth motion it had been doing at the trailer windows. I think I screamed. I honestly don't remember. I just yanked that blanket back over my head and curled into the tightest ball I could manage. I was trembling so hard my teeth were chattering. I kept mumbling prayers my grandmother taught me, anything I could remember. The rocking stopped. After what seemed like forever, I felt the Tahoe settle back to normal. No pressure against it. No movement. I waited, listening for any sound. Nothing. The silence was complete. I don't know where I found the courage, but eventually I reached for my keys that I'd left in the center console. My hand was shaking so bad I dropped them twice before managing to get them in the ignition. I didn't even look outside, just started the engine, threw it in reverse, and got the hell out of there, blankets and DVD player tumbling around as I sped away. I drove straight to a well-lit gas station in town and sat there until dawn, engine running the whole time. I couldn't stop shaking, couldn't stop checking the rearview mirror. When the sun finally came up, I called my brother-in-law, Ethan. He and some family members went back to the property that day. All they found were my tire tracks where I'd torn out of there. No footprints, nothing disturbed. My mother-in-law smudged the whole property that afternoon. It's been 17 years, and I still get nightmares about that face at the window, about that rocking motion. I've tried to make sense of what I saw. Some of the elders said it might have been Bigfoot, but that doesn't feel right to me. Others said it was the Dark Man, a spirit entity our people have known about for generations. All I know is I broke an unspoken rule of the reservation: never sleep outdoors at night. I go back to visit my kids at the property sometimes. I've even stayed over a few times when it's unavoidable, but never, ever alone. I always park under the security light, and if I have to tent, I set up extra lights all around. My ex-wife's family doesn't ask why, and I don't explain. They know. They've all heard the stories. To this day, I can't explain what I saw. I wasn't drunk, wasn't high, wasn't dreaming. It was real. And it was looking for something or someone. So take my advice. If you're ever on Pine Ridge, get yourself indoors before sunset. The night belongs to things we don't understand, things we weren't meant to see, things that are still out there, checking windows, looking for someone foolish enough to sleep where they don't belong. I've been debating whether to post this for weeks now. I'm not even sure if typing it out will help, but I need to tell someone what happened. Maybe one of you has experienced something similar or can make sense of it, because I sure as hell can't. 4 months ago, Amy and I signed the lease on what we thought would be our dream apartment. It was in this brand new complex called Evergreen Meadows, one of those places with the fancy kitchens, stainless steel appliances, and a gym in the building. The rent was surprisingly affordable because it was in a developing area about 20 minutes outside the city, right near some old railroad tracks and a small pond. Not exactly scenic, but we didn't care. It was our first place together after dating for 3 years. The day we moved in was perfect. We carried in boxes, arranged furniture, and unpacked until late afternoon. That night, we celebrated with a bottle of champagne Amy had been saving for a special occasion. We toasted to our future, talked about decorating plans, and fell asleep on our mattress on the floor because we hadn't set up the bed frame yet. I remember every detail of that night, the way Amy laughed when I accidentally popped the champagne cork against the ceiling, how she insisted on using real glasses instead of plastic cups, the Chinese takeout we ordered. Everything was normal, perfect even. Then morning came, and my life turned into this nightmare that I'm still living. I woke up alone on the mattress. At first I assumed Amy was in the bathroom or making coffee. I called her name but got no response. That's when I noticed movement in the corner of our bedroom. Amy was standing there, facing the wall. "Amy?" I said, thinking maybe she was looking for something or hanging a picture. But she didn't respond or move. I got up and walked over to her. "Hey, what are you doing?" I asked, touching her shoulder. Nothing. No response. Her body was completely rigid. I moved around to see her face, and what I saw still gives me chills. Her eyes were open, blinking occasionally, but there was nothing behind them. Just emptiness. She was breathing, but wouldn't respond to anything I said or did. I tried to move her away from the wall, but her body seemed almost magnetized to it. I could pull her back slightly, maybe an inch or two, but as soon as I let go, she would snap back into position. It was like some invisible force was holding her there. I completely freaked out. I called 911, told them my girlfriend was unresponsive and might be having some kind of medical emergency. While waiting for the ambulance, I tried calling Amy's parents. Her dad answered, and what he said made my blood run cold. "I'm sorry, who did you say you were looking for?" he asked when I mentioned Amy. "Amy. Amy Wilson, your daughter, I said, starting to get annoyed. This wasn't the time for jokes. Son, I don't have a daughter named Amy. I think you have the wrong number. My head started spinning. I'd met Amy's parents multiple times. We'd had dinner at their house just 2 weeks before. I started to wonder if I'd dialed the wrong number somehow, but it was the contact saved in my phone under Amy's dad. The paramedics arrived a few minutes later. I led them to the bedroom, pointing at Amy in the corner. Their response wasn't what I expected. "Sir, there's no one there," one of them said. I thought they were messing with me. "What do you mean? She's right there." I pointed directly at Amy, who was still facing the wall, blinking occasionally, completely unaware of what was happening. They exchanged looks. One of them asked if I was on any medications or had taken any substances. They started asking about my mental health history, if I'd been sleeping well, if I was under stress. They thought I was hallucinating. After they left, I took out my phone and tried to take a picture of Amy. The photo showed the empty corner. I tried video. Same result. There was nothing there, even though I could clearly see her with my own eyes. I spent the next few hours in a complete panic, going through our apartment. That's when I noticed something else that made no sense. All of Amy's things were gone. Her clothes weren't in the closet. Her toiletries weren't in the bathroom. Her plants, books, laptop. Everything was gone. Even her car wasn't in the parking spot we'd been assigned. I called the leasing office, thinking maybe there was some bizarre mix-up. "I need to speak to someone about my apartment. My girlfriend and I moved in yesterday, but something strange is happening," I explained to the property manager. "Mr. Miller, according to our records, you rented the apartment yourself. There's no co-applicant on the lease." I asked her to check again, insisting that both our names were on the documents we'd signed. "I'm looking at your lease right now," she said. "It's only signed by you." I drove to the leasing office to see for myself. She was right. The lease only had my signature. Amy's signature, which I'd watched her write just the day before, was gone. At this point, I was questioning my own sanity. Had I imagined Amy? Had I been living with a hallucination for 3 years? But that made no sense. We had mutual friends. We had photos together. We had a history. I went back to the apartment. Amy was still in the corner. I tried talking to her, touching her, playing her favorite music. Nothing worked. She just stood there, breathing and blinking, completely unaware. I called our friends one by one. None of them knew who Amy was. Our mutual friend Jake, who had introduced us at his birthday party 3 years ago, had no memory of her. My sister, who had gone shopping with Amy just last month, thought I was playing a weird joke. I checked social media. Amy's profiles were gone. Her Instagram, which had hundreds of photos, including many of us together, had vanished. I searched my own photos. Every picture that had included Amy now showed just me, or me with an empty space beside me where she should have been. The only concrete evidence I had that Amy had ever existed was in my own apartment. The still breathing, still blinking woman standing in the corner of my bedroom, facing the wall. For weeks, this was my reality. I went to work, came home, and Amy was always there, in the exact same position. I talked to her constantly, hoping for any sign that she could hear me. I tried to feed her, but couldn't get her to open her mouth. Yet somehow she was still alive, still breathing, still blinking. I tried moving her again and again, but that invisible force always pulled her back to the same spot. I reached out to doctors, psychiatrists, religious leaders, paranormal investigators, anyone who might help. Most thought I was crazy or playing an elaborate prank. Those who did believe me had no explanation. I searched online for similar cases and found nothing exactly like mine. though I came across stories of people suddenly forgetting loved ones or objects disappearing. Some suggested alternate dimensions, reality shifts, or glitches in the universe. None of it made sense, but neither did my situation. I couldn't leave Amy like that, even though no one else could see her. She was still real to me. I stayed in that apartment, sleeping on the couch because I couldn't bear to be in the bedroom with her standing in the corner. I kept hoping she'd snap out of it, or I'd wake up and find out it was all a terrible nightmare. About 3 months in, I started to notice small changes. Sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night and swear Amy's position had shifted slightly. Her head might be tilted at a different angle, or her fingers would be splayed against the wall instead of flat. But by morning, she'd always be back in the exact same position. Then, 4 weeks ago, everything changed again. I woke up in the middle of the night with that feeling you get when someone's watching you. I opened my eyes and nearly had a heart attack. Amy wasn't in the corner anymore. She was standing at the foot of my bed, looking down at me. But it wasn't really Amy. Not the Amy I knew. Her body was in an unnatural position, like a doll that had been posed by a child. Her head was tilted too far to one side, and her face, God, her face. She was smiling, but it wasn't Amy's smile. It was too wide, stretching literally from ear to ear. Her eyes were unblinking and fixed directly on mine. I couldn't move, couldn't scream, couldn't do anything but stare back at her. Then, after months of silence, she spoke. "David," she said, but her mouth barely moved with the words. "It's time for you to come join me. Take my hand, David. Come with me." She extended her arm toward me, the movement jerky and wrong, like a malfunctioning robot. Her hand hung in the air between us, waiting. I pulled the covers up to my chin like a terrified child. "Amy, what happened to you? Where have you been?" She didn't answer my questions. She just repeated, "Take my hand, David. Come with me." I don't know how long we stayed like that, her standing with her hand outstretched, me paralyzed with fear. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep from sheer exhaustion. When I woke the next morning, she was back in the corner again, facing the wall. After that night, I couldn't stay in the apartment anymore. I packed a bag and checked into a hotel. I called the leasing office and told them I needed to break my lease due to a family emergency. I started looking for a new place to live, but something kept pulling me back to the apartment. I'd go during daylight hours to pack more of my things, and Amy would always be there in the corner. I'd talk to her, trying to understand what was happening, but she never responded during the day. On what was supposed to be my last night, I'd found a new place and was planning to move out completely the next day. I went back to get the last of my things. Amy was in the corner as usual, but something was different. A single tear was running down her cheek. She was still smiling, that horrible, unnatural smile, her hand still outstretched, but she was crying. That broke me. Whatever this thing was, whether it was really Amy or something pretending to be her, it was in pain. And part of me still loved her, still wanted to help her. I almost took her hand that night. I got so close, my fingers were inches from hers when my phone rang, startling me. It was Jake, checking to see if I needed help moving the next day. That call probably saved my life. I left the apartment and went back to my hotel. The next morning, my phone exploded with notifications. Dozens of texts and missed calls, all from unknown numbers. But every message was from Amy. "Please come back. Take my hand, David. I need you. We can be together forever. Don't leave me alone here. I'm waiting for you. It hurts, David. Make it stop. Take my hand." I blocked the numbers, but new ones kept coming. I changed my hotel. I changed my phone number. It didn't matter. Somehow she always found a way to reach me. I'm writing this from yet another hotel room. I haven't been back to the apartment in 2 weeks, but I know she's still there, waiting. Sometimes I see her out of the corner of my eye, standing in my hotel room, or in the reflection of a window as I walk down the street. Always with that same stretched smile, that outstretched hand. Last night I dreamed of Amy, the real Amy, the way she was before all this happened. We were back in our new apartment on that first night, drinking champagne and planning our future. In the dream, she looked at me sadly and said, "You shouldn't have brought me here, David. This place wasn't empty when we moved in." I woke up in a cold sweat, and she was there again, at the foot of my bed. But now her eyes were bleeding, dark red tears streaming down her face, while that smile grew even wider, more twisted. I don't know what to do anymore. My friends think I'm having a mental breakdown. My family wants me to check into a psychiatric facility. Maybe they're right. Maybe none of this is real. But what if it is? What if Amy is trapped somewhere, and I'm the only one who can help her? Tonight I'm going back to the apartment one last time. I'm going to take her hand. I know it sounds crazy, but I need to know what happened to Amy, and this seems like the only way to find out. If she's somewhere else, somewhere beyond our reality, then I need to go there too. I can't leave her alone. If you're reading this and I never post again, at least someone will know what happened. And if you're ever looking for an apartment and find a too-good-to-be-true deal on a new unit near old railroad tracks and a pond, please, just keep looking. I don't know what's in that building, but it isn't just apartments, and I don't think it wants us to leave. And of course, I've been hesitant to share this for years. Even typing it out now makes my hands shake. What happened in our town isn't something I talk about, not even with family, but I need to get this off my chest before it eats me alive. I live in a small town about 2 hours from Mexico City. It's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone's business, where traditions run deep, and where the old superstitions never really died out. Most days are predictable: work, family, church, repeat, or at least they were, until Pancho arrived. It was around 3 years ago. I remember because it was right after the Day of the Dead celebrations. The old Hernandez house had been empty for years after the family moved to Guadalajara. Then one morning, we all woke up to the sound of a truck and men unloading furniture. Pancho had moved in overnight. He was a friendly guy, maybe in his mid-30s, with a weathered face and calloused hands. He told us he'd been working on offshore oil rigs, but wanted to settle down and start a carpentry business. Within days, he'd set up a small workshop in the garage. The sound of power tools filled the neighborhood, and the smell of fresh-cut wood drifted through the streets. At first, everything seemed normal. Pancho would wave to everyone, stop to chat, even helped my uncle fix his fence without charging a peso. He'd bring out cold beers and tell stories about life on the oil rigs. But there were oddities. Every night around sunset, he'd walk the perimeter of his property, throwing handfuls of salt on the ground. When my father asked about it, Pancho just laughed nervously and said it was just something from my hometown, Brujeria Tepercia. He said it protected against witchcraft. We all smiled politely, but when he wasn't looking, people would exchange glances. Nobody had heard of Brujeria Tepercia before. About a month after he arrived, something changed. It was a Tuesday night when we heard shouting and banging coming from Pancho's house. Several neighbors, including my father and I, walked over to see if everything was okay. The noises stopped abruptly as we approached. Pancho opened the door before we even knocked, looking flustered and oddly ashamed. "I'm sorry for the disturbance," he said, not meeting our eyes. "I was just rearranging some furniture." That's when she appeared behind him. I'll never forget my first glimpse of her. Tall and slender with shiny black hair that fell to her waist. Her skin was unnaturally pale for our region, almost like porcelain, and her hips were wide and white against the dark doorway. But it was her eyes that disturbed me. They were too dark, too knowing, like they could see right through you. "This is my wife," Pancho said, his voice suddenly hollow. "She's come to join me." None of us had known he was married. Not once in all his stories had he mentioned a wife. The woman smiled, but it didn't reach those eyes. She extended a hand that seemed too delicate for someone married to a carpenter. "I am Lucifer Amarillas Dissima Cruz," she said, with a slight accent I couldn't place. "But you may call me Lucy." There was an uncomfortable silence. Who names their daughter Lucifer? My father later said her hand felt ice cold. After that night, Pancho changed completely. We hardly saw him anymore. When we did, he looked thinner, paler, with dark circles under his eyes. He stopped working in his workshop. Instead, it was Lucy who would come out to buy groceries, to pay bills, to speak with neighbors. She was always polite, always smiling that empty smile that never touched her eyes. Things started happening around town about 3 weeks after Lucy's arrival. Small things at first. Chickens disappeared from coops, gardens were trampled, dogs would bark all night at nothing. Then came the first sighting. Old Miguel, who drinks too much tequila most nights, stumbled home past Pancho's house around 2 a.m. He swears he saw Lucy climb out of the bedroom window, drop to all fours, and transform into a large black dog before running toward the highway. Everyone dismissed it as drunken nonsense, until Doña Carmen saw the same thing a week later. She was up late sewing when she noticed movement outside her window. She watched in horror as a black dog leaped over Pancho's fence and transformed into Lucy right before disappearing around the corner. After that, more people came forward with similar stories. A black dog stealing chickens from Jose's coop. A black dog with unnaturally intelligent eyes watching children play. A black dog following women walking alone at night. In our region, we have stories about naguales, witches who can transform into animals. They're just old tales meant to scare children, or at least that's what I always thought. But as the sightings continued, people began whispering the word more and more. Things came to a head when Senora Vega saw Lucy, dressed in expensive clothes, getting into a fancy black truck late one night. Lucy had told Pancho she was visiting her sick mother, but Senora Vega swore the driver was a man, and they looked very intimate. When Senora Vega described the truck to us the next day, several people recognized it. It had been seen parked near the abandoned church on the edge of town multiple times. That same night, Pancho showed up at the cantina completely drunk. I wasn't there, but my cousin was. He said Pancho broke down crying, telling anyone who would listen about how he met Lucy at a dance in Veracruz, how he'd been instantly bewitched by her beauty. She gave him a bracelet that night, a love token, she called it, woven with black and red threads and small white beads. After that night, Pancho couldn't get her out of his mind. While working on the oil rig, he'd see her face in his dreams. Then he started seeing her reflection in mirrors, even when he was alone. Once, while staring into the ocean during a break, he swore he saw her face in the waves. The worst incident happened during an underwater inspection. Pancho said he turned around and saw her face in the murky water, but distorted, transforming. One moment it was Lucy, the next it was a dog, then a bird, then something he couldn't describe. He panicked, shot to the surface too quickly, and nearly got decompression sickness. After that incident, he requested shore leave and went looking for her in Veracruz. Somehow he found her, learned her name, and within weeks they were married. According to what he told the men at the cantina, she began draining him, his money, his energy, his will. When his mother fell ill back in his hometown, Lucy refused to visit her. His mother died without Pancho seeing her one last time. The final straw came when he was sent home early from the rig after a minor accident. He found strange herbs hanging in closets, animal bones buried in the garden, and a small room she'd forbidden him to enter filled with candles, drawings, and jars of unidentifiable substances. Worst of all, he found men's clothing that wasn't his hidden under their bed. Pancho went to his godmother, an old woman who knew about the ancient ways. She confirmed what he feared. Lucy was a nagual who transformed into a dog. The bracelet she'd given him had bound him to her, and she was using his life force to strengthen her powers. His godmother also told him Lucy was unfaithful, meeting with another nagual who could transform into a coyote. By the time Pancho finished his story in the cantina, most of the men were convinced. In our town, the old beliefs never really died out. My grandfather had taught me about protection against witchcraft since I was a child. Salt lines, specific prayers, herbs to burn. I never took it seriously until then. A plan formed quickly. The next night, a full moon, several men from town, including my father and uncle, gathered at Pancho's house. I wasn't supposed to be there, but I followed them anyway, hiding behind trees to watch. They surrounded the house with thick lines of salt and waited. Around midnight we heard shouting inside. Pancho was confronting Lucy, demanding she reveal her true nature. There was a scream that turned into something inhuman, a howl. Glass shattered as a large black dog leaped through the bedroom window. It all happened so fast after that. The men rushed forward with machetes, sticks, anything they could use as weapons. The dog, Lucy, was faster than any animal I'd ever seen, but she couldn't cross the salt lines. She was trapped in the yard. What followed still haunts my nightmares. The dog fought viciously, biting and clawing. 2 men were injured before someone landed a solid hit. The creature made a sound no dog should be able to make, almost like a woman's scream. More blows fell. I closed my eyes for most of it, but I couldn't block out the sounds. When it was over, they built a fire in the backyard. They burned the body immediately. No one wanted to see if it would transform back. As the flames grew higher, headlights appeared on the road. A black truck, the same one from Senora Vega's description, slowed down. A man's face appeared in the window, watching the fire. For just a moment our eyes met, and I swear his pupils were vertical, like a cat's. Then the truck sped away. Pancho was never the same after that night. He became a shell of himself, jumping at shadows and drinking heavily. His sister eventually came from Monterrey and took him away. The house has remained empty since. Nobody goes near it now. People say the walls are stained with symbols that can't be painted over, that if you peek through the windows, you feel watched from every corner. Some nights, if you walk past, you might hear a woman laughing or a dog growling. Sometimes it sounds like chanting, as if someone is casting a spell. I've never told anyone about what I saw that night. I'm not sure anyone would believe me. But ever since then, I keep salt by my door and windows. I wear a small pouch of protective herbs around my neck, and I never, ever go out alone on nights with a full moon. Last week, I saw a black truck parked at the edge of town. Same model, same tinted windows. Maybe it's nothing. Maybe it's just coincidence. But I don't think so. I don't think we killed the only nagual that night. I'm trying to get back to some level of normal right now, if that's even possible. My hands are still shaking as I type this, and I've been dry heaving for the past hour. I just need to put this somewhere so I'm not the only one carrying it. 3 days ago, I got back from what was supposed to be a solo camping trip in the Appalachians. I'd been feeling burnt out at work, deadlines piling up, performance reviews coming, the usual corporate pressure cooker stuff. My therapist suggested I disconnect completely. No phone, no laptop, just you and nature for a week, she said. It seemed like exactly what I needed. I packed light, just my tent, sleeping bag, some freeze-dried meals, and my camera. Photography's always been a way for me to decompress. Not like I'm any good at it, but I find something therapeutic about capturing moments. The drive to the trailhead was about 4 hours from my place in Charlotte. I remember feeling this weight lifting off my shoulders as the city disappeared in my rearview mirror. By the time I reached the mountains, I was already breathing easier. I hiked about 6 miles in before finding this perfect little clearing next to a stream. Not another soul in sight. Just what I wanted. I set up camp, filtered some water, and spent that first evening just sitting by the fire, watching the stars appear one by one. The week went by in a blur of hiking, reading, and just being. No meetings, no emails, no social media. I can't remember the last time I felt that kind of peace. I took photos every day, mostly landscapes, wildlife, and a few selfies to document my progressively grungier appearance. Yesterday morning, I packed up and headed back to civilization, already dreading the return to reality. But I felt recharged, like I could handle whatever was waiting for me. I got home late last night, unpacked my gear, and fell into bed without even checking my phone. This morning, I woke up early, made coffee, and figured I'd look through my photos before heading to work. That's when everything went to shit. The first photo on my camera was a group shot, me and 6 other people standing in front of what looked like a campsite with multiple tents. My tent was there, but so were 6 others arranged in a loose semicircle. The people, 3 men and 3 women, had their faces turned away from the camera or were blurry, like they'd moved right as the photo was taken. I stared at it for a good 5 minutes, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I had zero memory of meeting anyone on this trip, let alone camping with them. I was alone the entire time. I'm certain of it. I scrolled to the next day's photos. There we all were again. But now there were only 5 others with me. Same pose, same campsite, but one person was missing. A guy who had been standing on the far left in the first picture. My stomach started to knot up. I kept scrolling. Day 3, 4 people plus me. Day 4, 3 people plus me. Day 5, 2 people plus me, just me and a woman. In this photo, she had her arm around my waist, and I was smiling. Really smiling, not just a camera smile, like I knew her, like I was comfortable with her, but I have absolutely no memory of her, of any of them. What made it even worse was the background. With each photo, the campsite looked increasingly disheveled. By day 5, all the tents except mine looked damaged. Ripped fabric, collapsed poles, like they'd been through some violent storm. But I don't remember any bad weather during my trip. I checked the time and realized I was running late for work. I thought about calling in sick, but honestly, I didn't want to be alone with these photos and my thoughts. I grabbed my camera, threw on some clothes, and headed to the office, figuring I'd try to make sense of it all later. I work at a marketing firm where I manage a team of content creators. Nothing exciting, just the usual corporate ladder stuff. When I walked in, my assistant looked up with this expression I couldn't read. "Oh, you're back. How was the retreat?" she asked. I mumbled something about it being fine and hurried to my office. Retreat? What retreat? I was on a personal trip, not a company thing. As I was setting down my bag, Melissa from accounting poked her head in. "Hey, welcome back. Where is your wife? Didn't she come in with you?" The question hit me like a punch to the gut. My what? Melissa looked confused. Your wife? Rebecca? You guys drove together to the retreat, right? Is she coming in later? I don't have a wife. I've never been married. I live alone with my cat. Very funny, I said, trying to laugh it off. What's this about a retreat? Now Melissa looked concerned. The management retreat? The one you and the other department heads have been planning for months? You all left together last week. I felt cold sweat breaking out on my forehead. Right. Sorry, still getting back into work mode. Rebecca's, she's coming in later. Melissa gave me a weird look, but left without pushing it. As soon as she was gone, I collapsed into my chair, my heart pounding. That's when I noticed the photograph on my desk. It was framed, a picture I'd never seen before. It showed me with 6 other people, all smiling at the camera. They were clearly my co-workers, but I didn't recognize any of them. Except their faces matched the blurry figures from my camping photos. I picked up the frame with trembling hands. The plaque at the bottom read, Management Team Retreat, Appalachian Trail, 2023. I don't know these people. I've worked here for 3 years, and my team consists of people I know. Jen, Marcus, Alyssa, Dave, not these strangers. I pulled out my camera and started flipping through the photos again, comparing them to the framed picture, the same faces, the same people who had been disappearing one by one in my photos. The last person left in my camping photos, the woman with her arm around me, matched a woman in the framed office photo. According to the names at the bottom of the frame, she was Rebecca Miller, head of creative, my supposed wife. My hands were shaking so badly, I almost dropped the camera. I forced myself to keep scrolling to the final day's photos. The last picture made me physically recoil. It was just me, standing alone in front of my tent, smiling at the camera. Behind me, partially hidden by trees but unmistakable, were 6 bodies hanging from tree branches. Their necks were bent at impossible angles, heads turned a full 90 degrees. I could only see their backs, but I knew it was them. I slammed the camera down on my desk and ran to the bathroom, barely making it before throwing up everything in my stomach. When I could breathe again, I splashed cold water on my face and stared at my reflection. Who took that last photo? If I was alone in the picture, who pressed the shutter button? I went back to my office and locked the door. I called up the company directory on my computer and searched for Rebecca Miller. No results found. I tried searching for any of the other names from the frame. Nothing. I walked back out to my assistant's desk. Hey, can you get me Rebecca's extension? She looked confused. Who? Rebecca Miller, head of creative? Daniel, are you feeling okay? There's no Rebecca Miller here. Mark Wilson is head of creative, has been for years. I must have looked as bad as I felt because she immediately suggested I go home and rest. Said I seemed off since getting back from my trip. I agreed and grabbed my things, including the camera and the frame from my desk. As I was heading out, I passed Mark Wilson's office. The real Mark Wilson, who I've known for 3 years. Not whatever stranger was in that photo. On my way home, I tried to think rationally. Maybe someone tampered with my camera. Maybe this was some elaborate prank. But who would do that? And how would they get my co-workers involved? When I got home, I immediately checked my phone for the first time since getting back. No missed calls from a wife. No texts from these mystery people. Just the usual spam and a few messages from friends wondering how my solo trip went. I pulled up my photos on my laptop, thinking maybe seeing them larger would reveal some kind of manipulation or editing. But they looked completely genuine. No signs of Photoshop or tampering. That's when I noticed something I'd missed before. In the final photo, the one with me alone and the bodies, behind me, there was a shadow visible in the foreground. A shadow cast by whoever was taking the picture. It wasn't a human shadow. It was elongated, impossibly tall, with what looked like extra limbs or branches extending from it, like someone had merged with a tree. I'm sitting here now, doors locked, blinds drawn. I've called in sick for the rest of the week. I can't go back to that office. Not until I figure out what the hell is happening. The rational part of my brain is desperately searching for explanations. Maybe I had some kind of psychotic break during my trip. Maybe I ingested something toxic. But then why would Melissa ask about my wife? Why would my assistant mention a retreat and the photos? I can't explain the photos. I keep thinking about those tents in the background, getting more destroyed with each passing day. About the people disappearing one by one, about that final image, about that shadow. I don't know what to do. I'm afraid to sleep, afraid to close my eyes, because every time I do, I see those bodies hanging behind me, necks broken, swinging gently in a breeze I don't remember feeling. And worse, I'm starting to have flashes of memory, brief moments of clarity where I remember voices, screaming, the sound of something massive moving through the trees at night, the smell of fear. I think something followed me home from those mountains. I can feel it watching me now, and I think whatever took that final photo is waiting for me to complete the set. I never thought I'd be sharing this. Part of me still thinks maybe I shouldn't, but I need someone to know what happened. If I don't make it through the night, at least there will be a record. 3 years ago, I inherited 40 acres of remote land in the Appalachians from my great-aunt Marjorie. I was surprised. We weren't particularly close, but she had no children of her own. The property came with an old cabin that needed work, but I saw it as an opportunity to get away from everything. I was going through a rough patch after losing my job in Cincinnati, and the idea of living simply in the mountains appealed to me. The first 6 months were peaceful. I fixed up the cabin, learned to hunt, and kept to myself. The locals in the nearest town, about 40 minutes away by car, were friendly enough but kept their distance. That's how it is out here. People respect privacy. The first incident happened during winter. I was gathering firewood about 300 yards from my cabin when I heard what sounded like someone calling my name. At first, I thought it might be a hunter passing through, but the voice, it wasn't right. It sounded like my name was being spoken through a throat not designed for human speech, like someone learning to talk for the first time. I called out, thinking maybe it was just the wind playing tricks. That's when I saw it, just for a second between the trees. It looked like a person, but too tall, too thin. Its proportions were all wrong. When it moved, it was jerky, unnatural. I ran back to my cabin and locked the door, convinced I was seeing things. But I wasn't. That night, something circled my cabin for hours. I could hear footsteps in the snow, sometimes sounding like a person walking upright, sometimes like an animal on 4 legs. I stayed up all night with my shotgun, terrified. The next day, I checked the tracks. They started as human footprints, then morphed into what looked like coyote tracks, then back to human. I'm not some city boy who doesn't know tracks. I've been hunting since I was a kid. This wasn't normal. When I reported it to the local sheriff, he looked at me like I was crazy, said it was probably just a coyote and my mind playing tricks. but I know what I saw. After that, I started researching. The locals wouldn't talk much, but one old man at the general store pulled me aside after overhearing me ask questions. "Those are skinwalkers," he whispered. "Don't speak of them openly. Don't look for them. And whatever you do, don't hunt them." I thought he was just feeding into local superstition until I experienced more encounters. Over the past 3 years, I've learned to live with them. Not peacefully. We're not neighbors having barbecues. But I've developed strategies to survive. Today was different. Today, everything went wrong. It started this morning. I woke up early, around 5 a.m., to check my trail cameras. I've placed them strategically around my property to track the skinwalkers' movements. For months, I've noticed the same coyote appearing on multiple cameras. Always alone, always watching. A normal coyote would be with a pack, would follow predictable patterns. This one didn't. The cameras showed it had been circling closer to my cabin each night. Last night it came within 20 yards of my front door, stood on its hind legs and just stared at the camera for 2 hours without moving. No animal does that. I decided to check my traps. About 6 months ago, I started setting modified snares around the property. Not to catch anything, just as an early warning system. I coat the mechanisms with white ash after reading old folklore about it repelling skinwalkers. As I was checking the third trap, I found it had been triggered, but it wasn't intact. The metal parts were separated into 3 neat pieces, laid out in a triangle. The white ash was gone, and there was a strong smell of burning hair. I felt a chill run down my spine. In the dirt nearby was a single print, half human, half something else. When I got back to the cabin, I downloaded the latest footage from my cameras. The same coyote appeared, but something was different. It had what looked like a nasty burn scar down its left side. It stayed at the edge of the camera's range, watching but not approaching like before. I knew then that my defenses were working, at least partially. I should have been satisfied with that. I should have stayed in my cabin. But James and Cole showed up around noon. They're guys from town I occasionally have a beer with. They've always thought my skinwalker stories were bullshit. Just an eccentric hobby of the weird loner who lives in the woods. But today they seem different, excited. "We want to see these things for ourselves," James said, pulling a rifle from his truck. "We brought silver bullets. That's what kills them, right?" I tried to talk them out of it. "You don't hunt these things," I told them. "You can defend against them, ward them off, but you don't hunt them." But they were drunk on the idea of it, already imagining the story they'd tell back in town. Cole had brought white ash in plastic bags, and James had high-powered spotlights. They thought they were prepared. "Come on, man," Cole said. 3 guys armed to the teeth against what? Some coyotes that walk funny? We'll be fine." I should have refused. I should have made them leave. But part of me wanted validation, wanted someone else to see what I've been seeing so I wouldn't feel crazy anymore. So I agreed to take them out at nightfall. We left at 7:30 p.m., just as darkness settled over the mountains. I brought my rifle, a sidearm, and a backpack with essentials: water, a first aid kit, extra ammunition, flares, and my own bag of white ash. I made them follow specific rules. Stay together, don't split up for any reason, don't respond if you hear your name called, and if you see something strange, don't look directly at it. The first couple of hours were uneventful. We followed game trails, checking spots where I'd had previous encounters. Cole and James started getting bored, drinking from the flask Cole had brought. They became louder, less cautious. 3 hours in, We reached a small clearing about 2 miles from my cabin. The moon was bright, casting everything in a pale blue light. That's when I noticed Cole was gone. "Where's Cole?" I asked, feeling my heart rate spike. James looked around, confused. "He was right behind me a minute ago." We called for him quietly, not wanting to make too much noise. Then we saw him at the far edge of the clearing, standing perfectly still, facing away from us. "Cole!" James whispered sharply. "Get back here, man." Cole didn't respond. James started walking toward him, but I grabbed his arm. "Something's not right," I said, as if hearing me. Cole turned, but the movement was wrong, jerky, like a marionette being controlled by someone learning the strings. He tilted his head at an impossible angle, nearly 90 degrees. "What the fuck?" James muttered, raising his rifle. Before either of us could react further, James made a strange sound, a wet gurgling noise from deep in his throat. I turned to see him clutching his chest, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. He was trying to speak, but all that came out were guttural sounds, as if his lungs were filling with blood. I watched in horror as James fell to his knees, still making those awful sounds. His eyes rolled back in his head, and his body began to twitch. I looked back toward Cole, but he was gone. In his place was something else, a shape that only vaguely resembled a human, its limbs too long, its movements too fluid, yet somehow disjointed. I ran. I'm not proud of it, but every instinct in my body screamed at me to get back to my cabin. I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face. I lost my bearings in the panic and realized I was heading in the wrong direction. Forcing myself to stop, I pulled out my compass. The needle was spinning wildly, never settling. That's when I remembered one of the tricks I'd learned over the years. Skinwalkers can affect your equilibrium, make you walk in circles for hours until you're exhausted and vulnerable. I tilted my head onto my right shoulder, a counterbalance technique I discovered by accident during a previous encounter. Immediately, my sense of direction returned. As I oriented myself toward my cabin, I heard something moving through the woods parallel to me. Not pursuing directly, but pacing me, keeping up. I could hear its breathing, irregular, almost like laughter. I lost my flashlight somewhere in the panic. The moonlight barely penetrated the thick canopy, leaving me stumbling through near darkness. When I reached a steep ravine I didn't recognize, I realized I was still lost, despite my equilibrium trick. With no better option, I lit a flare. The sudden red glow illuminated my surroundings, and my blood turned to ice. I wasn't alone. They were all around me, 10, maybe 20 figures standing just at the edge of the light. Some looked almost human, others like animals standing upright, all wrong in ways that made my brain hurt trying to process. They didn't approach, seeming wary of the flare's light or perhaps the white ash I had sprinkled on my clothes before leaving. They just watched with reflective eyes that caught the light like animals but blinked sideways like a reptile's. I backed away slowly, keeping the flare between us. They parted, creating a path that I realized with growing dread led in the direction of my cabin. They were hurting me, letting me go. Why? It took me almost 2 hours to get back, though it should have been a 45-minute walk. Every few minutes I'd catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision. Sometimes I'd hear what sounded like Cole's voice calling for help, or James laughing. I didn't look. I didn't respond. When my cabin finally came into view, I nearly cried with relief. I sprinted the last 100 yards, fumbling with my keys at the door. Once inside, I locked every window, every door, and drew the protective symbols I'd learned over the years in white ash at each entrance. I hid in my bedroom closet, where I keep emergency supplies. That's where I'm writing this now, on my phone with 16% battery left. My right arm is burning where something clawed or bit me during my escape. I didn't even feel it happen, but now the wound is oozing something black that doesn't look like blood. It smells like copper and rot. I understand now what we did wrong. You don't hunt skinwalkers. You don't seek them out. They're not animals, not people. They're something else. Something that's been here long before us and will be here long after. They let you live if you respect boundaries, if you follow the rules. We broke the rules. We hunted them with silver and ash and modern arrogance. What happened to James and Cole is my fault. I knew better. The old man at the store warned me, and I ignored him because I wanted witnesses. Something's scratching at the walls of my cabin now. Not at the doors or windows where I placed the white ash, but at the bare wooden walls themselves. I can hear voices outside, James and Cole and others I don't recognize, all calling my name in that wrong way, like they're trying out my name for the first time. The scratching is getting louder. I think they're coming through the walls. My arm is going numb, the blackness spreading up toward my shoulder. I don't think I'm going to make it until morning. If anybody finds this, stay away from these mountains. Don't look for skinwalkers. Don't hunt them. And if you hear your name called in the woods by a voice that sounds almost, but not quite human, don't answer. I've never really believed in paranormal stuff. Ghost stories, demons, possession. I always thought it was just people's imaginations running wild or trying to explain things they didn't understand. That changed last month, and I still can't wrap my head around what happened. I barely sleep anymore. Every little noise makes me jump. I'm only sharing this because I need someone to tell me I'm not losing my mind. My roommate Nolan and I have always been into weird collectibles. Our apartment looks like some bizarre museum, old carnival props, vintage ads, weird taxidermy, that kind of stuff. Our other roommates, Amy and Sunny, tolerate our hobby even though they think it's creepy. We're all in our mid-20s trying to save money by sharing a house in the suburbs. It started when Nolan and I were driving home from getting pizza. We took a shortcut behind this half-abandoned strip mall, and that's when we spotted them. 3 white mannequins propped against the dumpster. They weren't the fancy department store kind, more like those featureless ones with smooth faces. They were surprisingly in good condition, just a little dirty. "Dude, we have to grab these," Nolan said, already pulling over. I remember thinking they'd look cool in our living room. Amy and Sunny would hate them, which honestly made me want them more. We loaded them into Nolan's truck and headed home, laughing about how we could position them to freak out our roommates. When we got home, we cleaned them up in the backyard with some soap and water. They were in better shape than I expected, completely intact, just some minor scuffs. Each one was about 6 feet tall, with bendable joints so you could pose them. They had this weird off-white color, almost like old bone. Amy came outside while we were setting them up in the living room and immediately shook her head. "Those are creepy as hell. I don't want to wake up to those things staring at me." "That's exactly why they're perfect," Nolan laughed. "Just wait. We're going to make them even better." That night, Nolan had this brilliant idea. He had some small Bluetooth speakers that we could hide inside the mannequins. We could connect to them remotely from our phones and make the mannequins talk to scare Amy and Sunny. We spent hours setting them up, drilling small holes for the speakers and testing them out. We positioned them around the living room, one standing by the TV, one sitting on the couch, and one by the hallway that led to our bedrooms. Sunny came home late from his shift and nearly had a heart attack when he saw them. "What the actual fuck, guys? I'm trying to relax after work, not feel like I'm being watched by these things." "They're art," I said. They add character to this place. They add nightmares is what they do, Sonny muttered, but he was too tired to argue more. That night, I went to bed feeling pretty pleased with our new decorations. I remember checking my phone before falling asleep. It was just after midnight. The next morning over breakfast, Nolan looked tired and irritated. "Very funny moving one of those mannequins outside my door last night," he said, pouring himself coffee. "What are you talking about?" I asked. "Woke up to pee around 3 a.m. and nearly shit myself when I opened my door, and that thing was just standing there facing my room." "Wasn't me," I said. "Must have been Amy or Sonny getting back at us." Amy walked in and overheard us. "I wouldn't touch those creepy things with a 10-foot pole," she said, grabbing her lunch from the fridge. "You guys are on your own with your weird doll collection. Sonny wasn't even home last night. He had stayed at his girlfriend's place." Nolan and I looked at each other, both confused. "Maybe you sleepwalked and moved it yourself," I suggested. Nolan shrugged it off. "Whatever, just don't do it again." That evening, we invited some friends over for drinks around our backyard fire pit. Everyone was creeped out by the mannequins, but in that fun way where people enjoy being scared. It was all normal until I had to use the bathroom. I went inside, leaving everyone laughing and drinking in the backyard. The house was dark, and I didn't bother turning on all the lights, just flipped on the bathroom switch. When I opened the door, one of the mannequins was standing right in the middle of the bathroom. I jumped back, cursing. The speaker inside it crackled to life. "Who?" It was just one word, but it sent chills down my spine. I figured Nolan was messing with me, using his phone to trigger the speaker while I wasn't looking. I checked my phone to see if I could connect to it, but the Bluetooth wasn't even activated on the speaker. "Very funny, Nolan," I called out, dragging the mannequin out of the bathroom and into the living room. I positioned it facing the wall as payback and went back to the party. When I got outside, Nolan was still sitting where I'd left him, his phone on the table in front of him. He couldn't have followed me inside without me noticing. I didn't mention the bathroom incident, figured maybe someone else was messing with me, or maybe the speaker had malfunctioned. After everyone left around 1 a.m., I helped clean up while Amy and Sonny went to bed. Nolan passed out on the couch, too drunk to make it to his room. I was the last one up, turning off lights and locking doors. When I got to my bedroom, I froze in the doorway. All 3 mannequins were lined up beside my bed. One of them had its arm outstretched, finger pointing at my mattress. The speaker inside it crackled again. Sleepy time. My blood ran cold. I checked the house. Nolan was still passed out on the couch. Amy and Sonny's doors were closed. No one could have moved all 3 mannequins to my room and set up the Bluetooth. I grabbed all 3 mannequins one by one, cursing under my breath, and dragged them back to the living room. I positioned them far from the hallway, facing the wall. I barely slept that night. I kept thinking I heard footsteps in the hallway, but I was too freaked out to check. I eventually fell asleep with my desk chair propped under my doorknob. The next morning, I woke up to sunlight streaming through my window. For a moment, I thought everything from the night before had been some weird dream. Then I saw it, one of the mannequins standing at the foot of my bed. Someone had drawn a smiley face on its blank head with black marker. Its speaker crackled. "Rise and shine." I scrambled out of bed, heart pounding. I dragged the mannequin out to the living room, where the other 2 were still positioned where I'd left them. Nolan was in the kitchen making coffee, looking hungover. "Did you put that thing in my room?" I demanded. He looked confused. "What?" "No, I just woke up. My head is killing me." "Someone drew a face on one of them," I said, showing him the smiley face. "Wasn't me," he said, looking genuinely confused. "Maybe Amy or Sonny are getting back at us." I knocked on their doors, but both denied touching the mannequins. Amy looked genuinely disturbed when I mentioned the smiley face. "Those things need to go," she said firmly. "They're giving me the creeps." "It's just someone messing with us," Nolan insisted, but he looked unsettled too. I went to shower, trying to convince myself there was a logical explanation. When I came out, everyone had left for work or class. I had the day off and decided to catch up on some reading in the backyard. That's when I saw them. All 3 mannequins were positioned around our fire pit, sitting in our lawn chairs. Each one was holding an empty beer can from last night. The one with the smiley face now had its head tilted slightly, like it was looking right at me. Something in me snapped. I ran to the garage, grabbed Nolan's baseball bat, and marched back out. I don't remember much of what happened next, just the satisfying crack as the bat connected with plastic, the way the heads shattered, arms snapping off. I demolished all 3 of them, breathing hard, sweat dripping down my face. I gathered up every piece, every fragment, and carried them to the alley behind our house. I dumped everything in the big garbage container and slammed the lid shut. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely text Nolan. "Got rid of the mannequins? They were freaking me out." He replied a few minutes later, "Probably for the best. Those things were weird." I felt relieved, like I'd taken control back. I went inside, took another shower, and tried to calm down. I watched TV for a while, had lunch, anything to distract myself. Around 3 p.m., I decided to go sit in the backyard again. It was a nice day, and I thought fresh air would help clear my head. When I stepped outside, my legs nearly gave out. The mannequins were back, arranged around the fire pit exactly as before. Except now, they had frowning faces drawn on them, and their broken pieces were held together with duct tape. Their white surface was dirty, like they'd been dragged through mud. One had its head attached backward, facing the wrong way. I backed up against the house, unable to process what I was seeing. There was no way anyone could have pieced them back together so quickly. I hadn't heard anyone in the backyard, and where would they even get the pieces from? I had thrown everything away. I grabbed the garden hose, turned it on full blast, and emptied the entire can of lighter fluid from our BBQ onto the mannequins. I lit a match and threw it. The flames shot up immediately, the plastic melting and bubbling. Black smoke poured into the sky. I stood there watching until they were nothing but twisted, charred lumps. The fire eventually died down on its own. I went back inside, locked every door and window, and sat on the couch, shaking. I called Nolan but got no answer. Same with Amy and Sonny. I was alone in the house with what remained of those things smoldering in our backyard. As the sun started to set, I convinced myself it was over. I had destroyed them completely this time. Nothing could come back from that. I got up to get a glass of water, passing through our living room. "Hot," came a raspy, crackling voice behind me. I turned around slowly. 3 charred, human-shaped figures stood in our living room. They weren't mannequins anymore. They looked almost organic, like burnt bodies standing upright. Smoke was still rising from them, and the carpet beneath them was beginning to singe. I ran to my bedroom, slammed the door, and pushed my dresser in front of it. I could hear them moving in the hallway, a weird shuffling sound. "Sleepy time," came the voice through the door, no longer coming from a speaker but sounding like it was being forced through damaged vocal cords. I'm writing this from my bedroom, where I've been barricaded for hours. My phone is nearly dead. I can still hear them outside my door, shuffling, occasionally whispering things I can't make out. The smell of burning plastic is everywhere. I don't know what those things were, or why they latched onto us. I don't know what they want. All I know is they weren't just mannequins when we found them. They were something else disguised as mannequins, waiting to be taken home, waiting to be noticed. The scratching at my door is getting louder. I don't think the dresser is going to hold much longer. If anyone reads this, don't take things that are abandoned. Some things are left behind for a reason. I still don't know how to fully explain what happened to me last month. I'm writing this down because I need to tell someone, and maybe someone here has gone through something similar and can help me. I've barely slept since it happened, and I'm starting to feel like I'm losing my mind. For context, I've lived near the Navajo reservation in Arizona for most of my life. My mom moved us here when I was 9, and I'm 22 now. Over the years, I've made many friends from the reservation, including my best friend, Kaya. We met in middle school and have been inseparable ever since. Kaya lives about a mile from my house, and I walk to her place all the time. The path between our houses cuts through a patch of forest. Nothing huge, just about a quarter-mile of trees and underbrush. During the day, it's pretty. Dappled sunlight, birds chirping, that sort of thing. But even in broad daylight, that forest always gave me the creeps. I could never shake the feeling of being watched when I walked through it. Kaya knows about my unease, and she's always warned me not to go through after dark. I always respected that until last month. It was a Friday, and I had gone to Kaya's place to hang out. We were binging a new show, and I completely lost track of time. When I checked my phone, it was already 7:30 p.m., and sunset was at 7. I immediately got up to leave, but Kaya tried to stop me. "Amy, just stay the night," she said, looking genuinely concerned. "You know better than to cross through the trees after dark." I should have listened to her. God, I wish I had listened to her. But I had an early shift at work the next morning, and I needed clothes from home. I assured her I'd be fine, that I'd walk fast and call her when I got home. She reluctantly agreed, but made me promise to go the long way around, using the road instead of the forest path. It would take an extra 20 minutes, but at least I'd be under street lights the whole time. I started walking the road route, but about halfway there I got impatient. The road curved away from my house, adding even more time to my walk. I could see the forest path entrance just ahead, a dark gap between the trees. I stood there for a minute debating. The forest would cut my time in half. I'd be home in 10 minutes instead of 30. So I made the decision that I still regret every single day. I veered off the road and headed toward the forest path. The moment I stepped under the trees, the temperature seemed to drop about 10 degrees. The moonlight barely filtered through the branches, leaving most of the path in shadow. I turned on my phone flashlight and walked faster, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread in my stomach. I was about 10 steps into the forest when I heard it, a loud snap of a branch somewhere to my right. I froze mid-step, my heart instantly hammering in my chest. Animals don't usually make that much noise, and hunters don't come this close to residential areas. "Hello?" I whispered, immediately regretting breaking the silence. For 1 second, there was nothing. Then my blood ran cold as I heard my exact voice echo back the same word. "Hello?" It wasn't just an echo. It was my voice, my exact inflection, coming from somewhere in the darkness to my right. I stood completely still, terrified to move. Then I heard it again from behind me. "Hello?" My voice, but not from my mouth. Then another, "Hello?" from my left, and another from straight ahead. My own voice was surrounding me, closing in from all directions. Each repetition sounded exactly like me, but with something slightly off that I couldn't place, like hearing your voice on a recording and not quite recognizing it. I was shaking uncontrollably by this point. my flashlight beam jerking wildly across the trees. I couldn't see anything, just endless shadows and branches, but I could feel something watching me from every direction. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. "Stop it!" I shouted, my voice cracking with fear. The forest went completely silent. No more echoes of my voice, no more branch snapping, nothing. I stood motionless, straining to hear anything, my breath coming in short gasps. A full minute passed in that unnatural silence, and that's when I realized something else was wrong. There were no forest sounds at all, no insects buzzing, no leaves rustling in the breeze, nothing, just dead silence. Then I heard it, a rustling in the bushes about 20 feet ahead of me. I pointed my flashlight at the sound, and something moved in the beam of light. At first, I thought it was just a deer. I saw antlers, huge ones, and the unmistakable shape of a deer's head emerging from the underbrush. Relief flooded through me for a split second. Just a deer, nothing to be afraid of. But that relief instantly transformed into pure horror as the deer head rose up and up and up until it was standing on two legs, at least 6 feet tall. The thing stood there, perfectly still, half deer and half something else, its antlers scraping against low-hanging branches. In the dim light of my flashlight, I could see its eyes reflecting back at me, glowing an unnatural yellow-green. I don't remember consciously deciding to run. My body just took over. I spun around and sprinted back the way I'd come, branches whipping at my face and arms. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. I ran the entire mile home without slowing down once, my lungs burning and my legs threatening to give out with every step. When I finally burst through my front door, I slammed it shut and locked it, then sank to the floor, gasping for air. My mom was in the living room watching TV. She took one look at me and rushed over. "Amy, what happened? Are you hurt?" I couldn't tell her the truth. What would I even say? That I heard my own voice in the forest? That I saw a deer standing on two legs? She'd think I was crazy or on drugs. So I lied and said, I thought I saw someone following me on the road, and I got scared and ran home. She checked all the doors and windows and said she'd call the police if I wanted, but I insisted I was probably just being paranoid. Eventually, she went back to her show, though she kept glancing at me with concern. Once my breathing returned to normal, I went to my room and called Kaya with shaking hands. As soon as she answered, I started crying. "Amy, what's wrong? Did you make it home okay?" she asked. Through sobs, I told her everything. The voice echoes, the unnatural silence, the deer thing standing upright. I expected her to tell me I was imagining things or had scared myself into seeing something that wasn't there. But she didn't. Instead, she went completely quiet for so long that I thought we'd been disconnected. "Kaya, are you still there?" "Amy, listen to me very carefully," she finally said, her voice deadly serious. "Don't go outside tonight. Don't look out your windows, and most importantly, don't respond if you hear anything calling to you, no matter what voice it uses. Promise me." The gravity in her voice sent a fresh wave of fear through me. "I promise," I whispered. "But what was it? What did I see?" She hesitated before answering. "My grandmother would call it yinodrochi. Some people call them skinwalkers. They're not natural. They're evil witches that can transform into animals or take on voices they've heard." "What does it want?" I asked, my mouth dry. "Nothing good," she replied. "It caught your scent, Amy. It heard your voice. It might follow you." I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed with all the lights on, jumping at every sound. Around 3 a.m., something changed in my room. It's hard to explain, but the air felt different, heavier, colder. and all the ambient noise suddenly stopped. The hum of my ceiling fan, the distant sound of cars on the highway, the neighbor's dog that always barks at night. All of it just ceased to exist. Then I heard it. From outside my window came my own voice. "Hello?" Exactly how I'd said it in the forest. Same inflection, same nervous tone. "Hello?" it called again. Then, "Stop it," in my panicked voice from the forest. I lay frozen in my bed, tears silently streaming down my face. It was here. It had followed me home. The thing kept repeating those phrases for what felt like hours. Then it did something new. It switched voices. "Amy!" it called in my mother's voice. "Amy, come here!" It was a perfect imitation, the exact way my mom calls me when she wants me to help with something. But my mom was asleep in her bedroom on the other side of the house. "Amy, honey," the thing continued in my mom's voice. "I need you. Come outside." I put my pillow over my head and pressed it against my ears, but I could still hear it. It kept calling all night, switching between my voice and my mother's, sometimes adding new phrases I'd said before. When the first light of dawn appeared, the voice finally stopped. I lay in bed, exhausted but too terrified to sleep. Later that morning, I called Kaya and told her what happened. She came over immediately, and we sat in my room as I recounted the night's events. "It's going to keep coming back, isn't it?" I asked her. She nodded grimly. "My grandmother has stories about these things. Once they fixate on someone—" She didn't need to finish the sentence. I understood. That night, Kaya stayed over. We pushed my dresser in front of my window and hung blankets to cover any gaps. Around the same time as before, 3 a.m., the air changed again. Then we heard scratching at my window, long, slow drags like antlers or claws against the glass. "Amy," it called, still using my mother's voice. "Let me in, Amy." When that didn't work, it switched tactics. It started making horrible, pained noises in my voice, whimpering and crying like I was being hurt. "Help me," it pleaded in my voice. "Please, help me." Kaya held my hand tightly as we sat on my bed, both of us shaking. "Don't answer it," she whispered, "no matter what." The worst came when it started using a child's voice, a little girl, maybe 5 or 6 years old. "Is anyone there?" the child's voice called pitifully. "I'm lost. Please help me." It was almost impossible not to respond, not to go to the window. The primal urge to help a lost child was overwhelming, but Kaya's grip on my hand tightened, reminding me to stay silent. This has been my life for the past month. Every night it comes. Sometimes it scratches at my window. Sometimes it calls my name in different voices. My mom, my dad who passed away years ago, Kaya, even my boss from work. It cycles through them all, trying to find the one that will make me respond or look outside. I've started sleeping at Kaya's house more often, but it follows me there too. Her grandmother has been helping us, burning sage and cedar, placing protective symbols around the house. It seems to keep the thing at a distance, but we can still hear it calling from the forest edge. I'm writing this because I don't know what else to do. I can't keep living like this. I'm exhausted and terrified all the time. I've started seeing a deer's shadow from the corner of my eye, even in broad daylight. Last week, I thought I saw antlers outside my workplace window, but when I looked directly, nothing was there. Kaya's grandmother says the only way to escape a skinwalker is to move far away, across water if possible. But I can't just uproot my life, and my mom won't understand why we need to move. I haven't told her anything. How could I explain this? So I'm asking, has anyone dealt with something like this before? Does anyone know how to make it stop? I don't think I can handle hearing my own voice calling to me much longer. Or worse, hearing it perfectly mimic my loved ones, begging me to come outside. Last night, it said something new. It whispered, so quietly I could barely hear it through the glass. "I will wear your skin, Amy," in my own voice. I've been sitting here for an hour trying to figure out how to start this. I keep typing and deleting because nothing seems to capture what happened that night last October. I guess I'll just dive in and tell it straight. I live in eastern Tennessee, about 40 minutes from the Appalachian Trail. It's beautiful here, especially in fall when the mountains light up with color, but there are parts of these hills that feel wrong, places where the shadows seem to linger too long. Cherryvale Road is one of those places. It was a Friday night, nothing special. My friends Hannah and Chris wanted to grab some late dinner at this diner that stays open until midnight. We'd been studying for midterms all week, and we needed a break. Hannah lived out past the main highway, down several winding back roads. I'd driven out there dozens of times before, usually in daylight, but I knew the way. After dinner, around 10:30, we were heading back to Hannah's place. Her mom was cool with us hanging out late, maybe watching a movie or something. I was driving my old Honda Civic, Chris was in the passenger seat, and Hannah was in the back, scrolling through her phone trying to find music. "Put on something good," Chris said, messing with the heater. It was chilly that night, low 40s probably, and my car's heater takes forever to kick in. "I'm trying," Hannah mumbled, still scrolling. "The signal out here sucks." We were on Cherryvale Road by then. It's this narrow, twisting back road that cuts through dense woods for about 5 miles. No streetlights, no houses, just trees pressing in from both sides, and the occasional reflective marker on sharp curves. My headlights barely cut through the darkness. There was no moon that night, which made it worse. I remember slowing down for a particularly nasty curve when I first spotted it. At first I thought it was just a piece of trash in the road, maybe a plastic bag or something. But as we got closer, I realized it was some kind of animal sitting right in the middle of my lane. "There's something in the road," I said, easing off the gas. Neither Chris nor Hannah responded. Chris was fiddling with his phone, and Hannah was still looking down at hers. I expected the animal to dart away as we approached. That's what animals do, right? They don't just sit there while a car bears down on them. But this thing didn't move at all. It just sat there, perfectly still, like a statue. I slowed down more, thinking it might be injured or something. The headlights fully illuminated it now, and I felt this immediate wrongness. That's the only way I can describe it. Like when you see something that doesn't compute, and your brain kind of shorts out for a second. It was cat-like in shape, about the size of a large house cat, but its proportions were off. Its body was too long, its legs too thin, and its fur, God, its fur wasn't right. It wasn't any normal cat color. It was this pale, pinkish beige color, almost like human skin that had never seen sunlight. Not albino, not white, but flesh-colored in a way that made my stomach turn. It was sitting perfectly still in a sphinx position, front legs extended, back legs tucked under, perfectly centered in my lane. Its head was angled up toward our car, and its ears, they were tiny, way too small for its head, almost like they'd been partially cut off. But it was the eyes that really got to me. They caught the headlights and reflected back this intense red-orange color with these little yellow flecks in them. It looked like someone had taken embers from a fire and shoved them into its eye sockets. I swear to God, they looked like the pits of hell. I was down to a crawl now, maybe 5 miles, and still this thing wouldn't move. It just stared at our car with those hellfire eyes, completely motionless. Not even a twitch of its tail, no blinking, nothing. "What is that?" I said, louder this time. I remember my voice sounding weird, higher pitched than normal. I felt this wave of anxiety wash over me. Not normal caution, but this primal dread that made my hands shake on the steering wheel. Every instinct was screaming at me to back up and find another way around. But that was ridiculous. It was just some animal, right? We were almost on top of it now. I had to make a decision. I couldn't stop. We were in the middle of nowhere, and something about that creature made me absolutely certain I didn't want to be outside the car with it. I couldn't drive over it either, so I aimed to pass it on the left, steering slowly around it. As we passed, it was maybe 8 inches from my driver's side door. I could see it clearly through my window. It still hadn't moved. Not a muscle, not a blink. Its head turned slightly, just slightly, to keep those burning eyes fixed on me as we passed. I swear I felt physical heat coming from its gaze. The moment we were past it, I hit the gas. I remember the surge of relief I felt, like I'd just avoided something terrible. "What the fuck was that?" Chris suddenly blurted out, twisting in his seat to look behind us. The fact that he'd seen it too hit me like a bucket of cold water. I wasn't hallucinating. "You saw it?" I asked, my voice still shaky. "That cat thing?" "Yeah, what the hell was that? It looked wrong." Hannah finally looked up from her phone. "What are you guys talking about? What cat?" "There was this weird animal in the road," I said, glancing in the rearview mirror. "It was just sitting there staring at us." Hannah turned around in her seat to look out the back window. "I don't see anything." "It was right there," Chris insisted. "Like right there in the middle of the road. It had these freaky eyes." "There's nothing there now," Hannah said, still looking back. I checked my mirror again. The road behind us was empty, completely empty. The thing was gone. "That's impossible," I said. "It was just there. It didn't move when we drove by. How could it be gone already?" We were all silent for a minute. I kept driving, faster than I should have on that winding road, but I wanted to get as far away from that spot as possible. "Maybe it ran into the woods?" Hannah suggested. "It didn't move, Hannah," Chris said. "I was watching it the whole time. It just sat there staring at us like some kind of, I don't know. It wasn't right." I was gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles were white. "Did you see its fur? That color wasn't normal." "Yeah," Chris nodded, "like skin-colored or something. Gross." "And those eyes," I added, then stopped. I didn't want to think about those eyes anymore. We drove another mile in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. Then, without discussing it, I pulled into the parking lot of the Baptist church that sits at the intersection of Cherry Vale and Route 16. I turned the car around so we were facing back the way we'd come. "What are you doing?" Hannah asked. "I don't know," I admitted. I don't want to keep going down Cherry Vale." "So we're going back the way we came?" Her voice had an edge to it. "Past that thing?" "We'll take the main road," I said. "It's longer, but—" "Yeah," Chris agreed. "Let's do that." The drive to Hannah's house took an extra 20 minutes, but none of us complained. We kept the conversation light, deliberately avoiding talking about what we'd seen, but it hung in the air between us like a bad smell. When we got to Hannah's, her mom was still up, watching TV in the living room. I wasn't planning to say anything about our experience. It seemed too weird, too hard to explain, but somehow it came up. "You guys look like you've seen a ghost," Hannah's mom joked when we walked in. "We saw something weird on Cherry Vale," Hannah said, throwing her bag down on the couch. "A small animal or something. It freaked these two out." I expected her mom to laugh it off, but instead she muted the TV and turned to face us. "What kind of animal?" she asked, her voice suddenly serious. I don't know, I said, caught off guard by her interest. It was like a cat, but not right. Her face went pale. Was it a cat? She asked, leaning forward. The three of us looked at each other. How did you know that? Chris asked. Hannah's mom set down her mug of tea. What did it look like exactly? I described it. The weird flesh-colored fur, the tiny ears, the unnatural stillness, and those terrible eyes. As I spoke, Hannah's mom's expression changed from curiosity to something like fear. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, I saw that same thing about 30 years ago right off Cherryvale Road. The room went silent. Hannah looked bewildered. Mom, what are you talking about? My cousin Jackie and I were walking back from the creek one evening. It was summer, still light out. We saw something moving in the bushes just off the trail. We thought it was a stray cat at first, but when it turned to look at us, she trailed off, shaking her head. It had those same eyes you described, like fire, and its fur was all wrong. We ran all the way home. Did you ever see it again? I asked. No, but I still think about it sometimes. She looked at me intently. Where exactly did you see it? About halfway down Cherry Vale, at that sharp bend near the big dead oak. She nodded slowly. That's less than a quarter mile from where we saw it. We stayed at Hannah's until after midnight, talking about what we'd seen and what it could be. Hannah's mom dug out some old books on Appalachian folklore, but nothing quite matched our creature. On the drive home, I took the long way around, avoiding Cherryvale Road completely. Chris was quiet most of the ride, but just before I dropped him off, he said, You know what's really messing with me? If Hannah's mom saw that same thing 30 years ago, what the hell is it? And why doesn't it age? That question has been haunting me ever since. I've done a ton of research since that night. I've looked up every possible animal native to eastern Tennessee. It wasn't a bobcat, wrong size, wrong coloration. Not a mountain lion or a fox either. Nothing matches what we saw. I've posted about it on nature forums and cryptid sites. Most people think we just saw a scared bobcat or a mangy coyote and our minds filled in the weird details. But that doesn't explain Hannah's mom seeing the exact same thing decades ago, and it doesn't explain how it vanished so quickly from the road. Some of the responses I've gotten suggest darker possibilities. A demon, a skinwalker, a wendigo, but none of those traditional descriptions quite fit either. I drive a different route now, even though it adds 20 minutes to my commute. I haven't been back on Cherryvale Road since that night, and I don't plan to, especially after dark. Sometimes I wake up at night thinking about those eyes, that unnatural stillness, the way it just stared at us, unblinking, unmoving, the way it seemed to be waiting for something. What bothers me the most isn't just what we saw, it's that I can't shake the feeling that it saw us too, really saw us, and recognized us somehow, like it knew exactly who we were and had been waiting for us specifically. I don't know what that thing on Cherryvale Road was. I don't know if it's still there, sitting in the middle of the road, waiting for someone else to drive by. Part of me hopes I'll never find out. But another part of me can't stop wondering, if Hannah's mom saw it 30 years ago and we saw it last October, who else has encountered it over the years? And what happens when you don't just drive past it? I still don't know what was hunting us that night in the Idaho mountains. It's been 8 years since it happened, but I remember every detail like it was yesterday. I've spent countless hours searching online for similar experiences, researching local folklore, even reaching out to park rangers. Nothing matches what we encountered. I'm finally sharing this because I need to know if anyone else has seen this thing. I was 12 when my parents decided we'd spend part of our summer vacation with my aunt's family in central Idaho. My sister Brianna was 14 at the time. We were pretty excited since we hadn't seen our cousins in almost 2 years. They lived in this beautiful house surrounded by pine trees with the Rocky Mountains as their backdrop. The first couple days were normal, catching up, playing video games with Alex, my 16-year-old cousin, and helping with chores around their property. Then Thursday came, and Aunt Melissa announced we were heading to their cabin for the weekend. I remember how my uncle described it during dinner. It's isolated, peaceful, the perfect getaway from technology. He wasn't wrong about the isolated part. After a 2-hour drive through winding mountain roads, we arrived at this small mountain town. We stopped at a local grocery store to stock up on supplies, and I noticed how different everything felt from the suburbs where I lived. Everyone seemed to know each other, and there was this strange quietness, like the mountains were watching us. From the town, it was another 30-minute drive on dirt roads to reach their cabin. When we finally pulled up, I was immediately drawn to the river behind the property. It was maybe 50 feet from the back porch, rushing with crystal-clear water that looked frighteningly cold even in July. Directly across was this massive wooded mountain that seemed to go up forever. I remember thinking it looked both beautiful and intimidating. The cabin itself was rustic but comfortable. 3 bedrooms, a loft where US kids would sleep, a big living room with a stone fireplace, and a kitchen that overlooked the river. There was no cell service, no internet, just a landline for emergencies. That first night, after hiking around the property and eating dinner, we played board games until around 11 p.m. Then we all headed up to the loft. The girls, my sister Brianna and cousins Julia and Karina, took one side while Alex and I took the other. I fell asleep pretty quickly, exhausted from the day's activities. I woke up around 2 a.m. needing to use the bathroom. After fumbling down the ladder in the dark, I made my way to the bathroom downstairs. The cabin was dead silent except for the occasional creak of the wooden floors under my feet and the distant sound of the river outside. When I got back to the loft, I felt uncomfortably hot. The summer night was warmer than expected, and with 5 of us sleeping up there, it was stuffy. Next to my sleeping bag was a small window, so I quietly unlatched it and pushed it open. The cool mountain air felt amazing, and I laid back down, listening to the soothing sounds of the river. That's when I heard it for the first time. About 15 minutes after opening the window, there was this sound from across the river, deep in the forest. It started as a high-pitched screech that cracked and rasped in a way that sent immediate chills down my spine. It wasn't an animal sound I recognized, not a mountain lion, not a bear, not an owl or coyote. The screech had an almost human quality to it, but distorted, like someone trying to imitate a person screaming, but getting it wrong in a terrifying way. I froze in my sleeping bag, suddenly wide awake. I waited, hoping it was just some weird bird or something I hadn't heard before. Then it came again, louder this time. It sounded closer to the river. I glanced at Alex, but he was still asleep. Everyone was. The sound came 3 more times, each getting slightly closer, until it seemed like whatever made it was right at the edge of the forest across the river. Then it stopped. I lay there for what felt like hours, heart pounding, afraid to move. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted back to sleep, but that sound stayed with me. The next morning, I almost convinced myself I'd dreamed it. Nobody mentioned hearing anything strange during the night, and I didn't bring it up. We spent the day fishing, swimming in the shallower parts of the river, even though the water was freezing, and helping the adults with small projects around the cabin. During lunch, Alex mentioned wanting to hike up the mountain across the river before we left on Sunday. "There's an awesome view from the top," he said. "You can see for miles." My aunt seemed hesitant at first. "Be back before dark," she finally said, "and take the walkie-talkies." So after dinner, around 6 p.m., Alex, Julia, 15, Karina, 10, Brianna and I prepared for our hike. Alex grabbed his backpack and filled it with water bottles, granola bars, and a first aid kit. Then he did something that surprised me. He took a pistol from a locked cabinet and checked that it was loaded before putting it in his pack. "Bears," he explained when he saw me staring. "Dad always makes me take it when we hike." He handed me a hunting knife in a leather sheath. "You can carry this if you want, just in case." I felt both nervous and important as I attached the knife to my belt. We told the adults we were heading out, grabbed flashlights since we might be coming back in twilight, and walked down to the river. There was a footbridge about a quarter-mile upstream that we used to cross. The trail on the other side was clearly marked, but not heavily used. It zigzagged up the mountainside through dense pine forest. For the first hour of hiking, everything was normal. We joked around, took pictures, and pointed out interesting plants or rocks. The higher we climbed, the more spectacular the view became. We reached the summit around 8 p.m. The sun was starting to set, casting this golden light across the valley. We could see the cabin far below, looking tiny next to the river that snaked through the landscape. In the distance were other mountains, some still capped with snow despite it being July. It was breathtaking. "We should head back," Alex said after we'd taken in the view for about 20 minutes. "It'll be dark soon." We started our descent, following the same trail down. About halfway down the mountain, I started getting this weird feeling. It's hard to describe exactly, but it felt like we were being watched. The forest had gotten quieter too. No birds calling, no squirrels rustling in the underbrush. Just our footsteps and the occasional snap of a twig. I was about to mention it to Alex when we heard it. The same raspy, high-pitched screech I'd heard the night before. But this time, it was much closer, maybe 100 yards away through the trees. Everyone froze. "What the hell was that?" Brianna whispered. "Probably just a mountain lion," Alex said, but he didn't sound convinced. The screech came again, and Karina grabbed my hand, squeezing it tight. "I want to go back to the cabin," she said, her voice shaking. "Let's pick up the pace," Alex said, taking the lead. "Stay together." We started moving faster down the trail. The sun had almost completely set now, and the forest was growing darker by the minute. Alex pulled out his flashlight, and the rest of us followed suit. The beams cut through the growing darkness, but somehow made the surrounding forest seem even blacker. We'd gone maybe another quarter-mile when the screech came again. It was closer now, and definitely following us. Then we heard something else. Heavy footsteps crashing through the underbrush, about 30 yards behind us. "Run," Alex said quietly, then louder. "Run!" We took off down the trail, our flashlight beams bouncing wildly. Karina started crying, and Julia grabbed her hand to pull her along faster. I could hear the footsteps behind us picking up speed, too. Alex suddenly stopped and pulled the pistol from his backpack. He fired 2 shots into the air. The sound was deafening in the quiet forest. "Get behind me," he shouted at us. For a moment, there was silence. Then the screech came again, this time from our right, closer than before. Whatever it was circling us. "It's hurting us," I realized with horror. The thing was smart enough to try to guide our movement. We continued down the trail, moving as fast as we could without running blindly. Alex kept the gun out now, constantly looking over his shoulder. The footsteps seemed to be keeping pace with us, always just out of sight. As we got closer to the river, the forest thinned slightly. In the dim light, I turned to check behind us and caught a glimpse of something moving between the trees. It was tall, much taller than a person, and seemed to be deliberately staying just at the edge of our flashlight beams. "Alex!" I hissed, pointing. He swung around, raising the gun, but whatever I'd seen had moved behind a large pine tree. We were maybe a quarter-mile from the river now. The bridge was further downstream, which meant we'd have to follow the riverbank for a while before crossing. Alex made a snap decision. "We're swimming across," he said. "It's the fastest way back." "The current's too strong," Julia protested. "We'll go to that bend where it's wider and slower," Alex replied, pointing ahead. "We don't have a choice." The screeching was almost constant now, seeming to come from multiple directions. I risked another glance back and saw it clearly this time. A tall, humanoid shape moving through the trees about 50 yards behind us. My blood ran cold. We reached the river's edge and paused momentarily. The water looked black in the darkness, the current swift but not as violent as other sections. "Stick together," Alex instructed. "Karina, get on my back." As he helped his youngest sister onto his back, I turned around one last time. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness and landed directly on what was following us. I'll never forget what I saw. Standing at the edge of the tree line, about 30 yards away, was a creature that looked vaguely human, but was horribly wrong. It stood at least 7 feet tall, with long, disproportionate limbs. Its body was covered in dark, matted hair or fur, but it was the face that haunts me to this day. A twisted, almost skeletal face with deep-set eyes that reflected red in our flashlight beams. Its mouth was open in what looked like a permanent snarl, revealing rows of jagged teeth. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I just stood there, flashlight trained on this thing that shouldn't exist. "Daniel!" Alex shouted, snapping me out of my trance. He followed my gaze, saw the creature, and immediately raised his gun. He fired 3 shots in rapid succession. The creature let out a screech that was so loud and agonizing it felt like my eardrums would burst. Then it moved, not away from us, but toward us, with a speed that didn't seem possible for something its size. "Go!" Alex screamed, shoving me toward the water. We all plunged into the freezing river. The cold was so intense it felt like thousands of needles stabbing my skin. The current immediately tried to pull me downstream, but I fought against it, keeping my eyes on the opposite bank where our cabin waited. Behind me, I could hear splashing as the others followed. The river wasn't particularly wide, maybe 40 feet at this point, but swimming across in clothes and shoes, fighting the current in near darkness, felt like miles. My muscles screamed from the cold and exertion. My lungs burned. I reached the other side first and pulled myself onto the rocky bank, turning immediately to help the others. Brianna came next, then Julia. Alex was last, still carrying Karina on his back. As they crawled onto the shore, I looked back at the forest we'd just escaped from. The creature was standing at the water's edge, its red eyes fixed on us. It let out one final blood-curdling screech before melting back into the darkness of the trees. We stumbled back to the cabin, soaking wet and shaking from both cold and fear. The adults were frantic when we burst through the door. They'd been trying to reach us on the walkie-talkies for over an hour. When we told them what happened, what we'd seen, they didn't know what to make of it. My uncle got his hunting rifle and stood watch on the porch for hours. My aunt made us hot chocolate and wrapped us in blankets, trying to calm us down. The next morning, my uncle and 2 men from town went across the river to investigate. They found large, unusual footprints near where we'd seen the creature, but nothing else. They followed the trail we'd taken up the mountain but saw no further signs of whatever had chased us. We left that afternoon, cutting our weekend trip short. On the drive back, the adults discussed what it could have been. A bear standing on its hind legs, a mountain lion, maybe even a person trying to scare us. But none of those explanations matched what we'd seen. I've never gone back to that cabin. My cousin's family sold it the following year, and I heard rumors that the new owners reported strange noises in the forest at night. I still have nightmares about those glowing red eyes and that horrible screech. I've researched local legends, cryptids, anything that might explain what we encountered. Nothing fits exactly. Sometimes I almost convince myself it was just the overactive imagination of 5 scared kids in a dark forest. But then I remember the way it moved, the intelligence in its eyes, the deliberate way it herded us along the trail. And I know what we saw was real. Whatever was hunting us that night is still out there in those mountains. I just hope no one else ever has to see it up close like we did. I still get goosebumps thinking about that night, even though it's been over 15 years now. I've never really shared this story outside my family, partly because I know how it sounds to people who didn't grow up with our traditions, and partly because the memory still terrifies me. I grew up in a small town called San Miguel de Allende in central Mexico. Not the touristy part you see in travel magazines, but the outskirts where regular families live. Our house wasn't fancy, just a simple 2-bedroom place my grandfather had built decades before. The thing that made our home different was the large backyard that stretched almost an acre into the forest edge. My grandfather kept sheep back there, 10 of them, in a small barn he'd constructed himself. I was 14 when it happened. It was December, unusually cold even for winter in our region, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones. We'd been having dinner, my parents, my younger sister Anna, my grandfather who lived with us, and me. Mom had made pozole, and we were all gathered around our small kitchen table when we heard it. The sheep started screaming. If you've never heard sheep in distress, count yourself lucky. It's not bleating. It's not like any normal animal sound. It's a shriek that sounds disturbingly human, like a person being tortured. One started. Then all of them were making this awful noise, and we could hear them throwing themselves against the sides of the barn. My father jumped up first, knocking his chair over. "Something's gotten into the barn," he said, rushing to the back window that overlooked the yard. The window was fogged up from the warmth inside meeting the cold glass. He wiped it with his sleeve and peered out into the darkness. What happened next is burned into my memory. My father's face, I've never seen him look like that before or since. The color drained completely, leaving his brown skin ashy gray. His mouth hung open. He didn't say anything for several seconds. "Roberto, what is it?" my mother asked, getting up to join him. "A coyote?" My father shook his head slowly, still staring. "Get the flashlight," he whispered. I grabbed the heavy metal flashlight we kept on top of the refrigerator and handed it to him. He clicked it on and shined it out the window. The beam cut through the darkness about 50 yards to where our small barn stood. The door was wide open, swinging on its hinges. "All the sheep are huddled in the corner," he said, his voice tight. "But there's something else in there." My grandfather, who had been quietly eating until now, put down his spoon. "What do you see, Hijo?" His voice was calm, but I could tell by the way he straightened in his chair that he was concerned. "I don't know," my father replied. "It's big, like a bear, but we don't have bears here." It's hunched over something in the middle of the barn." My mother crossed herself quickly. "Santa Maria, Madre de Dios." My grandfather stood up and walked to the window. He was 73 then, but still strong from a lifetime of manual labor. He looked out for just a moment before turning away. "Everyone stay inside," he said firmly. "Roberto, get my machete from under my bed." My mother grabbed his arm. "Papa, no, call the police." My grandfather gently removed her hand. "The police won't come all the way out here for animals, Lucia. You know that." "But what if it's not an animal?" my mother whispered. The way she said it made my skin crawl. I knew exactly what she was thinking. Growing up in rural Mexico, we all knew about naguales. They weren't just stories to scare children. They were treated as real threats, especially in small communities like ours. People who could transform into animals, who preyed on livestock and sometimes children. My grandmother, before she passed, used to warn us never to go outside alone at night because los naguales andan sueltos. The naguales are on the loose. My grandfather's expression hardened. "That's exactly why I need to go out there." My father returned with the machete, a long, worn blade that my grandfather used for clearing brush and harvesting crops. The handle was wrapped in leather, darkened by decades of sweat and use. "I'm coming with you," my father said. My grandfather shook his head. "No, stay here with Lucia and the children. If something happens to me, you take them and drive to town." I remember the look they exchanged, both men understanding something I couldn't fully grasp at 14. My father nodded reluctantly. "Take this," he said, handing my grandfather the flashlight. My grandfather took it and then surprisingly turned to me. "Miguel, bring me the salt from the kitchen." I ran to get the container of coarse salt we used for cooking. My grandfather took a handful and put it in his pocket, then handed the container back to me. "Stay away from the windows," he instructed all of us. Then he opened our back door and stepped out into the night. We watched from the kitchen window despite his warning, my father, mother, sister, and me, as his figure moved across our yard, the flashlight beam bouncing with each step. The sheep had quieted somewhat, but were still making distressed sounds. As my grandfather approached the barn, he slowed down. From our vantage point, we could see him reach into his pocket, presumably for the salt, before continuing forward. When he reached the barn door, he stopped. He called out in a loud, clear voice that carried all the way back to the house, "Fuera de aquí! Esta no es tu tierra! Get out of here! This is not your land!" There was a moment of complete silence. Even the sheep stopped making noise. Then we heard a wet, tearing sound that turned my stomach. My grandfather raised the flashlight higher, illuminating the inside of the barn. I couldn't see clearly from the house, but my father, whose eyesight was better than mine, inhaled sharply. "Dios mío," he whispered. "It's eating one of the sheep. But it skinned it first. The sheep is still alive." My mother pulled my sister away from the window then, but I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, watching as my grandfather took another step toward the barn door. "Te conozco por lo que eres," my grandfather shouted. "I know what you are." The creature inside must have turned toward him then, because my grandfather took a step back. The flashlight beam shook slightly in his hand. "It's looking at us," my father said. His voice was barely audible, but I heard the fear in it. "It's not an animal. Not really." Without thinking, my father grabbed a rock from the windowsill, one that my sister had painted in school, and ran outside. My mother called after him, but he was already halfway across the yard. He hurled the rock as hard as he could toward the barn. We heard it hit something solid, followed by a sound I will never forget as long as I live. a high-pitched yipping that transformed into something like human laughter. The sound raised every hair on my body. The thing bolted from the barn then, moving on all fours, but in a way no animal moves. It was dark and massive, at least the size of a large man, but hunched and distorted. It ran past my grandfather, who swung the machete but missed. The creature loped across our yard toward the forest edge, still making that terrible laughing sound. My father ran to my grandfather, and they both stood there for a long moment, staring after the creature as it disappeared into the trees. Then they turned and hurried back to the house, locking the door behind them. My mother was frantic. "What was it? What happened to the sheep?" My grandfather sat heavily at the kitchen table. He looked older than I had ever seen him. "One dead," he said. "Skinned completely, but still alive when that thing was eating it." My mother covered her mouth in horror. "The others are terrified but unhurt," my father added. He was pale, sweating despite the cold. "Was it?" I started to ask, but couldn't finish the question. My grandfather looked at me. "Yes," he said simply. "Un nagual." That night, none of us slept. My father and grandfather took turns keeping watch, armed with the machete and my father's hunting rifle. My mother burned sage in every room and placed lines of salt across each doorway and windowsill. My sister and I were made to sleep in our parents' room, with crosses pinned to our pajamas. In the morning, my father and grandfather went to dispose of the dead sheep. I wasn't allowed to see it, but I overheard them talking. The sheep had been skinned with surgical precision, not torn or mangled as an animal would do, but carefully, methodically, as if with a knife. Yet there were no knife marks on the carcass. 3 days later, our family friend Eduardo came to visit. He owned the small grocery store in town and knew everyone and everything that happened in our community. After the adults talked in low voices for a while, he asked to speak to my grandfather privately. They went into the back room, but I lingered near the door, straining to hear. "There's someone new in town," Eduardo was saying. "Showed up last week, stays at the old Martinez place that's been empty for years. Nobody knows where he came from." "What does he look like?" my grandfather asked. "Tall, thin, something not right about his eyes," Eduardo said. "I spoke to him yesterday when he came to buy meat. Only meat, nothing else. Lots of it, raw. I told him we don't welcome strangers who don't introduce themselves properly to the community." "What did he say?" "Nothing, just smiled. But later my dog went crazy when he walked past my house. Never seen my dog act like that." My grandfather was quiet for a moment. "Did you tell him to leave?" "Yes," Eduardo said. "I told him some places don't welcome outsiders for good reasons. I mentioned that people here know how to deal with those who aren't what they seem." "Good," my grandfather said. "If you see him again, let me know immediately." But we never saw the stranger, and we never experienced another incident like that night. My grandfather reinforced the barn with new locks and hung strings of garlic and special herbs around its perimeter. He also painted symbols above the door that he said would keep evil away. For months afterward, I had nightmares about that laughing sound and the way the creature had moved. Not quite animal, not quite human. Sometimes I still do, especially on cold winter nights when the wind makes strange noises through the trees. I'm an adult now, living in a city far from my family's home, but I still call my grandfather every December, around the anniversary of that night. Last time we spoke, I finally asked him something I'd always wondered. "Abuelo," I said, "what do you think would have happened if you hadn't gone out there that night?" There was a long pause before he answered. "In the old stories," he said, The nagual comes first for animals. Then, when it has tasted blood on your land, it comes for the children. I don't know if what we encountered was truly a person who could transform into an animal or something else entirely. But I know what I heard that night, and I know the fear I saw in my grandfather's eyes, a man who wasn't afraid of anything in this world. In Mexican culture, naguales are deeply feared for good reason. Some believe they're witches who transform to steal children for sacrifices and dark magic. Others think they're people born with a gift that can be used for good or evil. The most terrifying stories claim they're sent by the devil himself to collect souls that have been promised to him. All I know is that something hunted on our land that night, something that skinned an animal alive with human precision, but moved and sounded like no human I've ever known. Something that ran away when confronted not by bullets or blades, but by recognition and the old protections my grandfather knew to use. And sometimes, on nights when I'm alone and the shadows seem deeper than they should be, I find myself reaching for the small pouch of salt I still keep in my nightstand drawer, just in case. I was so excited when we first moved into the old house on Ashwood Street. It was a beautiful Victorian-style home from the 1930s, with intricate woodwork and stained glass windows. My husband Owen and I had been searching for the perfect place to raise our two kids, 8-year-old Lily and 5-year-old Max. This house seemed like a dream come true, spacious, full of character, and in a quiet neighborhood with great schools nearby. The first few weeks went by uneventfully as we settled in and unpacked. The kids loved exploring all the nooks and crannies of the old house. I remember thinking how lucky we were to have found such a gem. If only I had known then what horrors awaited us. It all started after we returned from a New Year's trip to visit my parents. At first, it was just little things that seemed odd but easy to explain away. A shirt I could have sworn I'd just washed would suddenly be missing from the laundry pile, only to reappear folded in my dresser drawer the next day. I chalked it up to my own forgetfulness and the chaos of unpacking from our trip. But then stranger things began happening. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, I distinctly heard the sound of heavy footsteps coming from the attic above. My heart started racing as I realized Owen and the kids were all downstairs. I called out, thinking maybe Owen had gone up there without me noticing, but there was no response. When I went to investigate, the attic was empty and undisturbed. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just the old house settling or pipes knocking. But deep down, a feeling of unease had taken root. I found myself jumping at every creak and groan of the floorboards. A few days later, Lily came running into our room in the middle of the night, crying that she had seen a shadow person standing in the corner of her bedroom. I comforted her and told her it was just a bad dream, but her words sent a chill down my spine. That same night, I woke up around 3 a.m. to use the bathroom and noticed all the lights in the hallway were on, even though I distinctly remembered turning them off before bed. The incidents kept escalating. Doors would slam shut on their own when there wasn't even a breeze. We'd hear muffled voices and whispers coming from empty rooms. The worst was when objects would move on their own. I once watched in horror as a glass slowly slid across the kitchen counter and crashed to the floor, shattering into pieces. Owen tried to stay skeptical at first, always looking for logical explanations, but even he couldn't deny the strange energy that had taken over our home. The kids were constantly on edge, afraid to be alone in their rooms. Lily had started wetting the bed again, something she hadn't done since she was a toddler. I remember the night things came to a head so vividly. We were all sitting down to dinner, trying to have a normal family meal despite the tension in the air. Suddenly, we heard it, loud, deliberate footsteps coming from directly above us. It sounded like someone was slowly pacing back and forth across the ceiling. Owen jumped up from the table, his face pale. "That's it. I'm going up there to see what the hell is going on," he said, grabbing a flashlight. "No, don't leave us," Lily cried, clinging to my arm. Max had started sobbing uncontrollably. The footsteps continued, growing louder and more frantic. It sounded like whoever, or whatever, was up there was running now, racing from one end of the attic to the other. The lights in the dining room began to flicker ominously. Just as Owen reached for the attic door, an ear-splitting shriek pierced the air. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, not quite human, but filled with rage and anguish. The entire house seemed to shake. In that moment, something in me snapped. "We need to get out of here now," I yelled, grabbing the kids and rushing towards the front door. Owen didn't argue, following close behind. We piled into the car in our pajamas, not even stopping to grab shoes or coats. As we peeled out of the driveway, I looked back at the house. For a split second, I swear I saw a dark figure standing in the upstairs window watching us leave. We spent that night in a hotel, shell-shocked and trying to process what had happened. The next day, Owen went back to the house alone to grab some essentials, while the kids and I waited anxiously in the car. He said everything seemed normal in the light of day, but he felt an oppressive heaviness as soon as he stepped inside. We never returned to live in that house. Owen's brother helped us move our belongings out over the next few weeks. We told the neighbors we were leaving due to a job transfer, too embarrassed and scared to share the real reason. It's been almost a year now since we fled Ashwood Street, but the memories of that place still haunt me. I have vivid nightmares where I'm trapped in the house, desperately trying to escape as an unseen presence closes in. Sometimes I wake up in a cold sweat, the phantom smell of smoke lingering in my nostrils. We've heard rumors that the new owners have experienced strange occurrences too. Part of me wants to warn them, to tell them to get out while they still can. But who would believe such an insane story? I still don't have any logical explanation for what we endured in that house. All I know is that there are things in this world beyond our understanding, darker and more terrifying than we can imagine. That house on Ashwood Street opened my eyes to a reality I wish I could forget. Even now, writing this out makes my hands shake. I keep looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that shadowy figure from the window. I don't know if we'll ever truly be free from whatever malevolent force inhabited that house. All I can do is hold my family close and pray that the nightmares will eventually fade. But deep down, I know the truth. Some houses are born bad, and the evil that dwells within them never truly dies. I just hope and pray that no other unsuspecting family falls victim to the horrors that await behind that innocent-looking Victorian facade on Ashwood Street. I was looking for some peace and quiet, a chance to get away from the hustle and bustle of city life. That's why I decided to rent a remote cabin up in the mountains for a week. Just me, my two loyal dogs, Scout and Bramble, and the great outdoors. No cell service, no Wi-Fi, no distractions. I thought it would be the perfect opportunity to relax, do some fishing, and clear my head. The first couple days were exactly what I hoped for. The cabin was cozy but well-equipped, nestled in a picturesque valley with snow-capped peaks in the distance. A large frozen lake stretched out in front of the property, promising good ice fishing. Scout and Bramble were in heaven, bounding through the snow and chasing each other around the yard. I spent my time chopping firewood, reading by the fireplace, and taking long walks through the silent forest with the dogs. At night, I'd sit out on the porch bundled up in blankets, marveling at the vast canopy of stars overhead. The peace and solitude were intoxicating after months of stress and overtime at work. On the third day, I decided to try my hand at ice fishing. I gathered up my gear, called the dogs, and headed out onto the frozen lake. The ice was thick and solid under my feet. I found a good spot about 50 yards from shore and started drilling a hole. Scout and Bramble ran circles around me, sliding across the slick surface and barking excitedly. As I was setting up my gear, I noticed how eerily quiet it had gotten. The constant background noise of birds and small animals that I'd grown accustomed to had vanished. Even the wind seemed to have died down completely. Scout and Bramble had stopped playing and were sitting tensely at attention, ears perked up. I tried to shake off the unsettling feeling and focus on fishing. After about an hour with no bites, I was about to pack it in when my line suddenly went taut. I reeled furiously, feeling the weight of a big catch. When I finally pulled it up through the hole, I nearly dropped my rod in shock. The fish was unlike anything I'd ever seen before. It was unnaturally pale, almost translucent, with milky white eyes that seemed to stare right through me. But the most disturbing part was the mass of writhing worms, visibly squirming under its skin and bursting out of lesions all over its body. I quickly cut the line and kicked it back down the hole, thoroughly disgusted. That night, I had trouble sleeping. The silence outside was oppressive, broken only by the occasional crackle from the fireplace. Scout and Bramble were restless, pacing around the cabin and growling softly at the windows. I tried to convince myself it was just typical animal behavior in an unfamiliar environment, but a nagging sense of dread had settled in the pit of my stomach. I must have dozed off eventually, because I was jolted awake in the early hours by a blood-curdling howl that seemed to shake the entire cabin. Scout and Bramble were going berserk, barking frantically and scratching at the door. Heart pounding, I grabbed my rifle and flashlight and cautiously approached the window. The full moon illuminated the snowy landscape outside, casting long shadows across the yard. At first I didn't see anything amiss. Then a flicker of movement caught my eye at the tree line. I trained my flashlight on the spot and felt the blood drain from my face. A massive, dark shape was moving through the trees with unnatural speed and agility. It was hard to make out details, but it seemed vaguely humanoid in form, only much larger, at least 8 feet tall. As it passed between two trees, I caught a glimpse of pale, elongated limbs and what looked like antlers protruding from its head. I stumbled back from the window in shock, my mind reeling. This couldn't be real. I must be having some kind of vivid nightmare. But the frenzied barking of my dogs and the lingering echo of that unearthly howl told me this was all too real. For the next few hours, I huddled in the center of the cabin with Scout and Bramble, my rifle clutched tightly to my chest. Strange noises drifted in from outside, heavy footsteps crunching in the snow, eerie vocalizations that were neither human nor animal, the sound of trees groaning and snapping. Several times dark shapes passed by the windows, always just out of clear sight. As the sky began to lighten with the approaching dawn, things finally quieted down outside. I waited another hour to be sure, then quickly packed up my essential gear. There was no way I was staying another night in this godforsaken place. I loaded up the truck as fast as I could, all while scanning the tree line nervously. Scout and Bramble seemed eager to leave as well, whining anxiously and pacing by the vehicle. Just as I was doing a final sweep of the cabin, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Massive tracks in the snow led right up to the porch and circled the entire cabin. They were easily twice the size of my boot prints, with long claw marks at the ends of the toes. Whatever had made them was no normal animal. I slammed the cabin door shut and sprinted for the truck. As I was pulling away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and could have sworn I saw a tall, antlered silhouette watching from the edge of the forest. I gunned the engine and didn't slow down until I hit the main highway hours later. It's been weeks since that terrifying night, but I still have trouble sleeping. I find myself jumping at small noises and constantly looking over my shoulder. Scout and Bramble seem on edge too, growling at shadows and refusing to go outside after dark. I've tried researching local folklore and cryptids from that area, but haven't found anything conclusive. Part of me wants to go back with a team to investigate further, but a larger part knows that some things are better left alone. Whatever inhabits those remote mountains is not meant for human understanding. I count myself lucky to have escaped with my life, and I won't tempt fate again. So if you're ever looking for a secluded cabin getaway, my advice is to stick to popular, well-traveled areas. There are things lurking in the deep wilderness that defy explanation, things that view humans as nothing more than prey. I learned that lesson the hard way, and I'll never forget it as long as I live. I was in desperate need of a break from the chaos of city life, so I decided to treat myself to a luxurious stay at an exclusive lodge nestled high in the Alps. As soon as I arrived, I felt the tension melting away. The crisp mountain air, the pristine blanket of snow stretching as far as the eye could see. It was like stepping into a winter wonderland. The first few days were absolute bliss. I spent my mornings carving fresh tracks down perfectly groomed ski runs, marveling at how effortlessly I glided through the powder. In the afternoons, I'd relax in the outdoor hot tub, letting the warm water soothe my muscles as I gazed out at the majestic snow-capped peaks surrounding me. Evenings were spent cozied up by a roaring fire in the lodge's grand stone fireplace, sipping hot cocoa and losing myself in a good book. It was everything I had hoped for and more. On the fourth day of my stay, I decided to explore some of the lodge's common areas that I hadn't checked out yet. As I wandered through a quiet hallway lined with framed vintage photos, one image in particular caught my eye. It was a black and white group shot, probably from the 1920s or 30s, showing a bunch of smiling guests posed out front of the lodge. But there was something off about it. In the back row, partially obscured by the others, was a man who didn't quite fit. While everyone else was dressed in the fashions of the era, he wore what looked like modern ski gear, a puffy jacket and pants that seemed out of place. His face was blurry, as if he had moved right as the photo was taken. I leaned in closer, squinting to try and make out his features. A chill ran down my spine as I realized his gaze seemed to be looking directly at the camera, at me. I shook my head, telling myself I was just seeing things. Lack of sleep from all the fresh air and exercise, probably. I continued on with my day, hitting the slopes for a few more runs before heading back to my room to get ready for dinner. As I was changing, movement outside my balcony caught my eye. I froze, watching as a dark figure walked slowly across the snow, heading straight for my room. My heart began to race as I realized it was a man dressed exactly like the one from the old photo. Same puffy jacket, same blurry face. He stopped directly in front of my balcony and slowly raised his head to look right at me. I stumbled backwards, fumbling for my phone to call the front desk. But by the time I looked back up, he was gone. Vanished, leaving no footprints in the fresh snow. My hands shaking, I called down to report what I'd seen. The staff was very accommodating, sending security to do a thorough check of the grounds. They found nothing out of the ordinary. I tried to brush it off as my imagination running wild, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach. That night I tossed and turned, unable to fall asleep. Every creak of the old lodge made me jump. Around 2 a.m. I heard it, 3 sharp knocks on my door. I lay frozen in bed, hardly daring to breathe. Then came a voice, muffled but clear. "Let me in, I've been waiting so long." I squeezed my eyes shut, willing it to be a dream. The knocking came again, more insistent this time. "I know you're in there. I saw you earlier. Let me in." The doorknob began to rattle. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I don't know how long I lay there, paralyzed with fear, before I finally worked up the courage to inch out of bed and peer through the peephole. The hallway was empty. I spent the rest of the night huddled in the armchair by the door, every muscle tense, jumping at the slightest sound. As soon as the first rays of dawn began to creep through the curtains, I threw my belongings haphazardly into my suitcase and practically ran to check out. The woman at the front desk seemed concerned by my frazzled state, asking if everything was all right. I muttered some excuse about a family emergency requiring me to leave early. As she processed my checkout, she handed me an envelope. "Oh, I almost forgot. This was left for you last night, a little souvenir of your stay with us." My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a copy of that old group photo I had seen in the hallway. But this one was different. The blurry man in the back was in sharp focus now, his face clearly visible. It was me. I dropped the photo like it had burned me and bolted for the door, not even bothering to grab my receipt. I didn't breathe easy until I was in my car, speeding down the winding mountain road away from that place. It's been months now, and I still wake up in a cold sweat some nights, hearing those knocks on my door. I've tried to rationalize it, to tell myself it was all just a vivid, stress-induced hallucination. But then I'll catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, a figure in a puffy jacket, watching me from across a crowded street or reflected in a store window, and that icy fear grips me all over again. I don't know what happened up there in that lodge. I don't know who or what that man was, or why he seemed so fixated on me. All I know is that I'll never set foot in the mountains again. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. I've debated for a long time whether to share this experience. Part of me worried people would think I was crazy, but I finally decided to post it here, hoping that maybe someone else has encountered something similar. If nothing else, maybe getting it off my chest will help me finally move past it. Has anyone else had strange experiences in secluded mountain lodges? Ever felt like you were being watched by something that shouldn't be there? I'd love to hear your stories. Anything to make me feel less alone in this. For now, I'm sticking to beach vacations. Sand and sun seem a lot less likely to hide dark secrets than snow and silence. If you're planning a ski trip anytime soon, well, just be careful. And maybe think twice before looking too closely at any old photos you come across.